The air in Constantinople stank of burning pitch and fear as the last Roman emperor, Constantine XI, stood atop the crumbling Theodosian walls, his fingers digging into the cold stone as though he could halt the inevitable with sheer will. Below him, the Ottoman siege engines groaned under the weight of their own menace, their iron-tipped battering rams swaying like pendulums of doom, while the distant war drums of Mehmed II's army throbbed in time with the panicked heartbeat of the city. The once gilded domes of Hagia Sophia flickered under a blood-orange dawn, their reflections shimmering in the puddles of rainwater mixed with the filth of 1,000 desperate refugees crammed into the streets, their prayers rising in a dissonant chorus that did nothing to drown out the screams from the outer trenches where the janissaries were already scaling the barricades. Constantine's armor, a relic of a dying empire, felt like a shroud, the weight of 8 centuries of history pressing down on his shoulders as he turned to his generals, their faces gaunt with hunger and betrayal, and knew with icy certainty that before the sunset, the last fragment of Rome would be swallowed by the tide of history, and all that would remain of his reign would be the legends of how a man faced annihilation without blinking. Somewhere beyond the smoke-choked horizon, a single cannon, the monstrous basilica, roared to life, its stone shot carving a jagged scar across the sky, and in that suspended moment before impact, the emperor whispered the words that would outlive him, "Let me be the last casualty of Byzantium." Chapter 2. The cannonball struck the wall with a cataclysmic roar, sending a shockwave through the bones of the city as masonry exploded outward in a hail of deadly shrapnel, cutting down a cluster of Genoese mercenaries who had barely raised the shields in time, their blood splattering across the cobblestones like a grotesque fresco of sacrifice. Constantine stumbled back, his ears ringing, the taste of iron thick on his tongue as the world narrowed to the jagged breach now yawning before them, a gateway for the horde, a fatal crack in the spine of Byzantium. Around him, men scrambled like ants in a flooded nest, some clutching icons to their chests, others dropping their weapons to flee, but the emperor knew there was no retreat, not from this, not from the moment history had been waiting for since the first Turk set foot on Anatolian soil. He seized a fallen banner, its gold thread frayed and splattered with mud, and thrust it into the hands of a boy no older than 16, his face pale with terror but his grip firm as death itself. "Hold this," Constantine growled, "until your fingers rot or God takes you," and then he was moving, shoving through the chaos toward the breach where the first janissaries were already pouring through, the curved blades gleaming like the teeth of wolves, their war cries swallowed by the thunder of collapsing stone. The air reeked of saltpeter and sweat, of fear and fanaticism, and somewhere in that maelstrom, a priest chanted the Kyrie eleison even as an arrow sprouted from his throat, his voice gurgling into silence. Constantine raised his sword, not the jeweled ceremonial thing of parades and treaties, but a plain, brutal length of steel, and met the first Ottoman with a clash that sent sparks skittering across the rubble, his muscles screaming as he parried, hacked, and lunged, each movement a defiance, each breath a rebellion against the dying of the light. Chapter 3. Mehmed II watched from his scarlet pavilion, his fingers drumming against the hilt of his shamshir as the battle unfolded like a chessboard of flesh and fire, his mind already leaping ahead to the moment he would ride through the shattered gates and claim the title he had hungered for since boyhood, Caesar-i-Rum, Caesar of Rome. The siege had cost him too much, ships dragged over land, cannons forged in the sweat of Hungarian engineers, the patience of his commanders worn thinner than the walls they now assailed, but none of it mattered now, not when the prize was so close he could taste it in the back of his throat, metallic and sweet as victory. A messenger collapsed at his feet, gasping about Venetian reinforcements sighted in the Marmara, but Mehmed merely smiled and flicked a hand, dismissing the threat. Let them come, let all of Christendom come, they would find only corpses and a new master of the Bosporus. His gaze snapped back to the breach where Constantine's dwindling forces fought with the desperation of men who knew their souls were already measured, and for a fleeting instant, he felt a stab of something like pity, or was it admiration, for the emperor who refused to kneel even as the earth crumbled beneath him. "Take him alive," he murmured to his grand vizier, though he knew the order was futile, legends were not made of men who surrendered. A roar went up from the Turkish ranks as another section of the wall buckled, and Mehmed's pulse quickened, his breath coming faster now, the scent of smoke and blood and destiny thick in his nostrils. Somewhere in the chaos, a standard bearer planted the Sultan's banner atop a broken tower, its crescent moon catching the light of the setting sun, and the cry of Allahu Akbar rolled across the battlefield like a wave, drowning out the last prayers of the Romans. Chapter 4. In the shadow of the crumbling Blashenai Palace, a Venetian gunner named Enzo Dragato jammed his torch into the breech of his falconet, the recoil nearly dislocating his shoulder as the shot tore through a column of advancing Sipahis, their horses screaming as their riders were reduced to crimson mist. He had fought for coin in a dozen wars, from the mud of Flanders to the deserts of Syria, but this was a death without glory, a last stand for a city already rotting from within. The Greek soldier beside him crossed himself and muttered to a St. Enzo didn't recognize, then promptly took an arquebus shot to the face, his teeth scattering across the rampart like dice. Christ's bones, Enzo spat, wiping gore from his eyes, we're not even getting paid for this. He reached for another powder charge, but his fingers met empty air. Out, they were out, and the Ottomans were coming, their ranks parting for a monstrous figure in gilded armor, a giant of a man swinging a double-bladed axe as if it weighed nothing. Enzo drew his dagger, the blade notched from 100 whetstones, and wondered if his wife in Venice would ever learn how he died, or if his name would vanish like the empire he'd accidentally sworn to defend. The axe came down, and the world split into pain and light, and then, nothing. Chapter 5. The last thing Giustiniani Longo heard before the darkness took him was the wet, sucking sound of the surgeon's fingers probing the crossbow bolt buried in his ribs, the agony so vast it seemed to fill the tent, the city, the whole damned world. He had been dragged from the walls like a sack of butchered meat, his famed Genoese plate armor peeled back like fruit rind, and now the whispers around him carried the weight of a death sentence, peritonitis, fever, the Sultan's gold is closer than the doctor. He tried to laugh, but it came out as a wheeze, blood bubbling at the corner of his lips. All that planning, all those contracts, and here he was, dying in a tent stinking of piss and rust, his mercenaries already melting into the alleyways to save their own skins. Outside, the sounds of battle had shifted, fewer Greek shouts, more Turkish drums, and he knew, with the clarity of a man who had spent his life weighing costs, that Constantinople was done. The surgeon leaned in, his breath reeking of garlic and despair, and said something about prayers, but Giustiniani waved him off. "Save your piety," he croaked. "Give me wine, a sword, and 5 minutes on my feet." The surgeon hesitated, then handed him a flask of something that burned like Hades' own piss. Giustiniani drank deep, felt the fire in his gut eclipse the pain, and lurched upright, his vision swimming. If he was going to hell, he'd do it with a blade in his hand and a curse on his lips. Chapter 6. Somewhere in the maze of alleys behind the hippodrome, a girl named Theodora pressed her back against the soot-stained wall of a baker's oven, her arms locked around her little brother's chest to keep him from sobbing loud enough to betray them. The sack over her head had slipped during the panic, and now she saw the nightmare in flashes, a janissary dragging a pregnant woman by her hair, a priest swinging a censer like a mace until a scimitar opened his belly, the stray dogs lapping at the blood pooling between the cobblestones. Her brother trembled against her, his breath hot and rapid against her collarbone, and she clamped a hand over his mouth, her own tears cutting tracks through the grime on her face. They had been running since dawn, when their mother shoved them into the streets with a whispered, to Hagia Sophia, run. But the great church might as well have been in Jerusalem now, for all the good it did them. A crash echoed from the next street, followed by the guttural laughter of men who had ceased to be men, and Theodora closed her eyes, her lips moving in a prayer older than the city itself. "St. Michael, defend us in battle," she breathed, just as the bakery door splintered inward, and the choice became fight or fade into the darkness. She reached for the baker's peel, its iron edge dull but heavy, and tightened her grip. Chapter 7. High in the dome of Hagia Sophia, The mosaics of Christ Pantocrator stared down with unblinking eyes as the first Ottoman soldiers burst through the imperial doors, their boots slipping on the marble slick with the blood of the faithful who had sought sanctuary at the altar. The invaders froze for a heartbeat, their weapons lowering as they gaped at the golden heavens above, the sheer scale of the place striking even the most hardened among them dumb with awe. Then the spell broke, and the looting began, silver chalices ripped from trembling priests' hands, vestments torn to wrap stolen icons, a janissary hacking at the iconostasis with his axe just to hear the sound of splintering wood. In the choir, a lone monk kept singing, his voice cracking but unwavering as he chanted the Trisagion, the hymn rising above the cacophony like a thread of smoke from a snuffed candle. A soldier yanked him from his stool by his beard, but the monk didn't stop, even as the dagger flashed, even as his life pulled around his knees, his last word, Porgios, swallowed by the laughter of the conquerors. Outside, the call to prayer echoed from the minarets that were not yet minarets, and the wind carried the ashes of Byzantium across the sea, where they would settle in the mouths of kings and poets, a bitter taste of endings. Chapter 8. Constantine's sword arm had gone numb an hour ago, the muscles shredded from the relentless tide of attackers, but still he fought, his body moving on some instinct deeper than thought, deeper than fear. The battle had narrowed to a knot of Varangians and a handful of Venetian sailors, their backs to the ruins of the million, their circle tightening with every fallen comrade. Someone had thrust a spear into his left hand at some point, and he used it now to gut a janissary who got too close, the man's intestines spilling over the emperor's boots like wet rope. The sun hung low and bloated in the sky, the light filtering through the smoke in shafts of hellish orange, and in that moment, Constantine knew with absolute certainty that he would not live to see it set. He had shed his imperial regalia hours ago, no use making himself a target, but the men around him still fought with the fury of those who knew they guarded the last Roman, the last flicker of a flame that had lit the world for 1,000 years. A blade scraped along his ribs, and he gasped, the pain sharp and bright, but before the killing stroke could land, a giant of a Varangian buried his axe in the attacker's skull, roaring, for the emperor. As the body crumpled, Constantine nodded his thanks, his voice long since lost to shouting and dust, and then the world exploded in a flash of white as a mace connected with his temple, and the last thing he saw was the glint of the double-headed eagle on his banner, trampled into the mud. Chapter 9. Mem stepped over the corpse of a Greek fire-thrower, the man's face blackened by his own weapon, and paused to adjust his turban, the silk damp with sweat and the spray of the Bosporus. The city was his, not just the walls, not just the palaces, but the idea of it, the weight of its name, and yet the victory tasted strangely hollow, like a fig robbed of its honey. He had expected resistance, yes, but not this stubbornness, this refusal to bend even in annihilation. His men were already at work, herding captives into chains, piling bodies for burning, chiseling crosses from the walls, but his gaze kept returning to the broken figure being carried toward him on a shield, the dead emperor's face pale beneath the blood and grime. He had wanted Constantine alive, had dreamed of the moment he would offer him clemency or humiliation, but fate had robbed him of the choice. Find his head, he told his vizier, and mount it on the million. Let the world see the price of defiance. Then he turned toward Hagia Sophia, where his imam waited to consecrate the great church to Allah, and as he walked, he kicked aside a discarded icon of the Theotokos, her painted eyes staring up at him with silent accusation. The wind shifted, carrying the stench of death and the salt of the sea, and for the first time in his life, Mem the Conqueror felt the chill of something like doubt. Chapter 10. 3 days after the fall, the rats came. They swarmed from the sewers and the collapsed cisterns, their bellies swollen with the feast of the unburied dead, their eyes gleaming in the moonlight as they scuttled over the ruins of the Forum of Constantine. In a cellar near the Horror Monastery, Theodora clutched her brother to her chest, her fingers sticky with the honey they'd looted from a shattered pantry, their only sustenance in this new world of Turkish patrols and slave markets. The boy had not spoken since the bakery, his voice lost to terror, but his eyes followed every shadow, every flicker of torchlight through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. Somewhere above them, a woman wailed, a sound that cut off abruptly, and Theodora pressed her palm harder over her brother's mouth, her own breath shallow. They would leave tonight, she had decided. There were rumors of Genoese ships still daring the blockade, of secret tunnels leading to the docks, of a price to be paid for passage but a greater price for staying. She touched the knife at her belt, the baker's peel long since abandoned, and tested its edge against her thumb. It would do. The rats gnawed at something fleshy in the corner, their teeth clicking like dice, and Theodora closed her eyes, imagining the sound was the tide, carrying them away, away from the corpse of the city, away from the end of history. Chapter 11. The night reeked of smoke and salt as Theodora dragged her brother through the corpse-choked alleyways, their bare feet slipping on blood-slicked stones, their ears straining for the telltale clank of Ottoman patrols between the distant screams that still echoed from the direction of the forum. The boy moved like a sleepwalker, his fingers clamped around her wrist with a strength that belied his small frame, his silence more unnerving than any cry. They had passed 3 bodies already, 2 Greek soldiers with their throats slit like pigs, and a woman in a torn silk gown, her jewels ripped from her ears leaving ragged holes, but Theodora forced herself not to look, not to think, because thinking meant remembering the way her mother had shoved them toward the door as the janissaries kicked it in, the last glimpse she'd had of her, a flash of her blue headscarf, a hand outstretched not in farewell but in futile defense. The harbor wasn't far now. She could smell the brackish tang of the Golden Horn cutting through the stench of death, could hear the faint creak of ship timbers and the occasional shouted order in broken Italian. A dog barked suddenly from a courtyard to their left, and they froze, pressing into the shadow of a half-collapsed wall, just as a trio of Turkish soldiers lumbered past, their arms laden with looted icons, laughing about the price they'd fetch in Edirne. Theodora counted to 50 before moving again, her pulse hammering in her throat, and then they were running, stumbling, the boy's breath coming in ragged gasps as the alley spilled them out onto the wharves where the wreckage of the Byzantine fleet smoldered in the shallows like the bones of leviathans. Chapter 12. The Genoese galley was smaller than Theodora had imagined, its sails patched, its deck crowded with hollow-eyed refugees who clutched their children and their meager sacks of grain as if the Ottomans might still come plunging into the waves after them. A gaunt sailor with a scarred lip eyed her and her brother as they approached, his gaze lingering on the boy's fine wool tunic, now stained with soot and worse, before jerking his chin toward the gangplank. 2 ducats, he grunted. Theodora's stomach clenched. She had no ducats, only the knife and the clothes on their backs, but desperation made her bold. "We have nothing," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "but my brother can scrub decks, and I can mend sails." The sailor spat into the water, then grinned, revealing a mouthful of rotted teeth. "Pretty thing like you, the captain'll find other uses for those hands." Behind her, the boy made a sound like a wounded animal, and Theodora felt something harden in her chest, a thing colder than fear. She slid the knife from her belt, not threatening, just visible. "We'll work," she said softly, "but we'll not be slaves." The sailor's grin faded. For a long moment, he studied her face, the dirt, the defiance, the shadow of the girl she'd been a week ago, then sighed and waved them aboard. "Get in the hold," he muttered. "And if anyone asks, you're my cousins from Pera." Chapter 13. Mehmed paced the length of the great palace's triclinium, his boots crushing shattered mosaics underfoot as his engineers debated whether the cracked dome overhead could be salvaged or must be torn down. He barely heard them. Constantinople was his, yes, but it was a corpse of a city, its streets stinking of rot, its people broken or fled, its fabled wealth plundered by his own men before he could secure it. The Venetian envoy had arrived at dawn with oily condolences and a proposal to ransom half the nobility now chained in the hippodrome, and Mehmed had let him sweat for an hour before agreeing. Not for the gold, but for the message it would send. He was no barbarian sacking a prize, but a ruler inheriting an empire. Still, the emptiness gnawed at him. He'd dreamed of walking these halls since boyhood, of sitting on the throne of Justinian, But now that he stood here, all he could think was how small it all seemed, how the walls leaned with the weight of centuries, how the ghosts of dead emperors whispered in the draughts that slithered through the cracks. A slave entered with a tray of figs and wine, trembling so violently the cup rattled, and Mem struck it from his hands in a sudden fury, the porcelain shattering against the wall like the skull of that last Greek defender he'd ordered impaled on the Adrianople gate. "Bring me the architect," he snarled to no one in particular. "I want this place scrubbed, rebuilt, remade. And find me someone who speaks Latin. I have letters to send to Rome." Chapter 14. The galley's hold stank of vomit and mildew, the darkness broken only by a single lantern swaying with the ship's nauseating lurch. Theodora curled her body around her brother's, trying to shield him from the worst of the jostling as the man beside them, a one-eyed monk who reeked of garlic and despair, reached into a bucket for the third time that hour. The boy hadn't spoken since the wharf, but now, in the close blackness, his lips moved against her ear. "Are they really gone?" Theodora stiffened. She knew what he meant: their parents, their home, the world they'd known, but the truth was too vast to speak aloud, so she lied. "We'll find them in Italy," she whispered back. Father had friends in Venice. The boy nodded, his trust a knife in her heart, and she tightened her arms around him as the ship pitched violently, sending a crate of chickens sliding across the floor. Somewhere above, a sailor shouted about the wind shifting, and the one-eyed monk began to pray in a language Theodora didn't recognize. She closed her eyes and imagined the rats back in the cellar, their tiny teeth gnawing at the bones of the city, and wondered if Constantinople had ever been real at all, or just a dream they'd all shared until the cannons woke them. Chapter 15. On the fifth day, the bodies in the streets began to bloat. "Shall I keep going? I'll assume silence means, continue. Continue until I say stop and rewrite Chapter 15. Chapter 15, rewritten. The bodies had begun to bloat under the relentless Anatolian sun, the skin splitting like overripe fruit as the gulls feasted, their beaks tearing away strips of flesh with grotesque delicacy. The stench clung to the city like a shroud, seeping into the cracks of boarded-up houses, curling around the ankles of Ottoman soldiers who kicked through the rubble in search of forgotten treasures. Near the old Forum of the Bull, a pack of wild dogs fought over a severed hand still clad in a signet ring, the last remnant of some nobleman who had thought his lineage would protect him. Theodora glimpsed the scene from the shadows of a ruined granary where she and her brother hid, waiting for nightfall, for a chance to slip past the patrols to the docks. The boy had begun to whisper to himself, nonsense words and fragments of prayers, his fingers plucking at the threads of his tunic as if unraveling it might also unravel the horror around them. She forced a crust of moldy bread into his hands, watching as he chewed mechanically, his eyes fixed on the distant column of smoke rising from the direction of the Blashenai Palace, where the last of the imperial archives was said to be burning, centuries of laws and treaties and births and deaths reduced to ash in the conqueror's haste to rewrite history. Somewhere beyond the corpse-choked Lycus River, a drum began to beat, slow and inexorable, a funeral march for a city that had already died but didn't yet know it. Chapter 16. The drumbeat led them to the docks, where the remnants of the Byzantine fleet smoldered in the shallows, their blackened ribs jutting from the water like the skeletons of drowned giants. Theodora counted 3 Genoese galleys still moored, their decks swarming with refugees, merchants clutching sacks of coin, nuns with their habits torn, a one-armed Varangian bleeding quietly onto the planks, all pressed together in a stinking, sweating mass of desperation. A Venetian captain in a salt-stained doublet stood at the gangway, his arms crossed as he appraised the survivors with the cold calculation of a butcher pricing meat. 10 ducats for a place below deck, he announced to the crowd, his voice cutting through the wails of a woman mourning her trampled infant. 20 for a cabin, 50 if you want a loaf of bread with that. Theodora's stomach twisted. She had nothing but the knife and the clothes on their backs, but as her brother's knees buckled from hunger, she did the only thing she could think of. She stepped forward, pulled the gold-threaded icon of Saint Demetrios from inside her tunic, the one her mother had sewn into the lining the night before the siege, and pressed it into the captain's palm. His eyebrows rose as he bit the edge to test its purity, then jerked his chin toward the ship. "You get the hold," he said. "And if the boy dies before we make port, you'll toss him overboard yourself." Chapter 17. The hold was a pit of darkness and suffering, the air thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and the sour tang of fear. Theodora carved out a space near the hull, where the sloshing bilge water soaked their legs but at least offered a wall to lean against. Her brother curled into her side, his breath shallow, his fingers clutching her sleeve as if she might vanish like the city behind them. Around them, the whispers swirled. The Sultan had ordered the walls rebuilt thicker than before, the Hagia Sophia was being stripped of its mosaics, the surviving noblewomen had been divided among the janissaries as spoils. A man with a broken nose claimed to have seen Constantine's head mounted on a pike, but a woman hissed that it was a lie. The emperor's body was never found, and some said he slept beneath the city, waiting to return when Christendom called. Theodora closed her eyes and tried to remember the Constantinople of her childhood, the smell of honey cakes in the market, the sound of the choirs in the Church of the Holy Apostles, the way the sunset turned the dome of Hagia Sophia to fire. But all she saw was the baker's peel in her hand, the way it had felt when it connected with the janissary's skull, the wet crunch of bone giving way. Chapter 18. Mem stood on the seawall, watching the last Genoese galley shrink into the horizon. He should have ordered it sunk. The fools were doubtless smuggling away nobles, relics, secrets, but let them go. Let them carry the tale of his mercy, his magnanimity, back to their squabbling Italian cities. The wind tugged at his robes, carrying the scent of salt and charred wood, and for a fleeting moment, he imagined he could hear the echoes of the city that had been, the clatter of looms in the Mise, the cry of fishmongers in the Neorian, the midnight chanting of monks in the Studian. All gone now, all soon to be. Behind him, his grand vizier cleared his throat. "The masons await your command, my sultan. They ask if you wish the Theodosian walls rebuilt as they were, or tear them down," Mem said. "All of them. Build new ones, taller, thicker, with my name carved into every stone." He turned his back on the sea, on the past, on the faint outline of the galley disappearing into the haze. Constantinople was dead. Long live Istanbul. Chapter 19. The galley's hold was a tomb of shadows, the only light filtering through the cracks in the deck above, painting stripes of gold on the faces of the damned. Theodora's brother had begun to shiver despite the heat, his skin waxy and damp. She pressed her lips to his forehead and tasted fever. Around them, the refugees had fallen into a stupor, their moans blending with the creak of the ship's timbers. A child whimpered for water, but no one answered. Theodora closed her eyes and dreamed of rain, cold, clean rain sluicing through the streets of a city that no longer existed, washing the blood from the stones, filling the cisterns to overflowing. When she woke, her brother was staring at her, his eyes too bright. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. She strained her ears. Only the groan of the ship, the slap of waves against the hull. "Hear what?" "The drums," he said, smiling for the first time in days. "They're playing our song." Chapter 20. On the morning of the 7th day, the boy died quietly, his breath stuttering out between one wave and the next. Theodora held him long after his body cooled, her tears carving paths through the grime on her face. When the sailors came to take him, she didn't fight. She watched as they wrapped him in a scrap of sailcloth and dropped him overboard, his small body vanishing into the depths without a splash. That night, she climbed onto the deck and stared back at the horizon where the city had been. The sky was clear, the stars sharp as knives. Somewhere out there, the rats were still feasting, the dogs still fighting over bones, the conquerors still picking through the ruins of the only world she'd ever known. The wind picked up, filling the sails, carrying the ship, and Theodora, into the unknown. Chapter 21. The ship groaned as it cut through the waves, the timbers protesting under the strain of the overloaded hull, the stench of human misery thick enough to choke on. Theodora leaned against the rail, her fingers digging into the wood until her nails splintered, her eyes fixed not on the horizon but on the dark water below, where her brother's body had vanished without ceremony. Around her, the other refugees huddled in silence, their faces hollowed out by grief and hunger, their clothes stiff with salt and old blood. A Venetian sailor shoved past her, his breath reeking of cheap wine, his hand lingering too long on her waist before she jerked away with a snarl that made him laugh. "Careful, Greek," he mocked, "or you'll join your little rat in the deep." Theodora's hand twitched toward the knife she no longer had, lost in the scramble to board, or stolen while she slept, but before she could spit a retort, the lookout's cry rang out, "Sail!" Starboard side, the deck erupted into chaos as passengers surged to the rail, their voices rising in a cacophony of hope and terror. Was it rescue? Pirates? Another Ottoman warship, hungry for the stragglers who'd slipped their net? The captain bellowed orders, the crew scrambling to adjust the sails as the strange vessel closed in, its banners snapping in the wind, a red lion on a gold field. Theodora didn't recognize the sigil, but the man beside her, a silk merchant missing 3 fingers, gasped. "Ragusan," he whispered, "Christ save us, they'll ransom us back to the Turks for profit." Theodora's stomach turned. She'd heard stories of the Ragusans, their city a nest of merchants who'd sell their own mothers for the right price. The captain was shouting now, demanding arms, but the refugees had nothing left to fight with, nothing left at all. Theodora closed her eyes and imagined the cold embrace of the sea, the quiet of the depths. But when she opened them again, the Ragusan ship was alongside, and a man in a fur-trimmed cloak was peering down at them with the bored disdain of a cat eyeing a wounded bird. "Survivors of Constantinople," he called, his Greek tinged with a Dalmatian drawl. "How quaint." The captain straightened, his hand on his sword. "This is a Genoese vessel," he lied. The Ragusan laughed. "No, it's a floating coffin. And I'm here to offer your cargo a choice: die at sea, or come work off your debt in Ragusa." Theodora didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her chin raised. "I'll go." The merchant grabbed her arm. "Girl, you don't know what you're..." She shook him off. "I know exactly what I'm doing." The Ragusan's gaze flicked over her, assessing her like a piece of livestock, then nodded. "Welcome to your new life." Chapter 22. The Ragusan ship stank of fish and tar, the deck slippery with brine as Theodora was herded below with a dozen others, the youngest, the strongest, the ones with the least fight left in them. A woman sobbed quietly, her face buried in her hands, but Theodora felt nothing, not even when the sailor tied a rough hemp bracelet around her wrist, marking her as indentured. 5 years' service, he grunted. "Less if you're pretty and compliant." Theodora said nothing. 5 years was nothing. 5 years was a lifetime away from the corpse of Byzantium, from the memory of her brother's body sinking into the dark. The ship's hold was cramped but cleaner than the Genoese galleys, the air thick with the scent of salt and wet wool. She claimed a corner, ignoring the whispers of the others, their speculations about what awaited them in Ragusa: servitude in a merchant's house, labor in the dockside brothels, a life of scrubbing floors until their backs gave out. Theodora didn't care. She'd scrub, she'd kneel, she'd do whatever it took to survive, because survival was the only revenge left to her. Outside, the waves slapped against the hull, a relentless rhythm that sounded almost like the drums of the Janissaries, the ones her brother had heard in his fevered dreams. Theodora closed her eyes and let the sound carry her away, into a dream of her own, a city in flames, a sword in her hand, a golden-haired boy waiting for her in the shadows. Chapter 23. Ragusa rose from the sea like a mirage, its white walls gleaming in the morning sun, its red roofs tumbling down the hillside to meet the harbor where 100 ships jostled for space. Theodora had heard tales of the city, a republic of merchants, a place where gold mattered more than God, but the reality was stranger than she'd imagined. The air smelled of spices and sewage, the streets teemed with men in silks and slaves in chains, and everywhere, the chatter of deals being struck, fortunes being made and lost between one sip of wine and the next. The Ragusan overseer herded them onto the quay, his whip cracking just close enough to make them jump. "Line up," he ordered. "The buyers are coming." Theodora stood stiffly, her hands at her sides, her face blank. She wouldn't cower, wouldn't beg. Around her, the others trembled, their eyes darting to the well-dressed men and women picking through the new arrivals with the dispassionate efficiency of butchers selecting cuts of meat. A stout merchant with a perfumed beard paused in front of Theodora, his gaze lingering on her face, her hands, her too thin frame. "Greek?" he asked. She nodded. "From Constantinople." Another nod. He sighed, as if disappointed. "Pity. The Turks have made Greeks a glut on the market." He moved on. Theodora exhaled, her fists clenched. The sun climbed higher, the heat pressing down like a weight, and just as she began to wonder if they'd be left to rot on the docks, a voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. "That one." Theodora turned. The woman was older, her face lined but sharp-eyed, her dark gown trimmed with silver. She pointed at Theodora with a hand adorned with a single ruby ring. "I'll take her." The overseer grinned. "A fine choice, Lady Bona. She's got spirit." The woman, Lady Bona, ignored him. "What's your name, girl?" Theodora lifted her chin. "Theodora. No family name, no title. Just Theodora." Lady Bona's lips curved. "Good. A name with history. Come along, Theodora. You belong to me now." Chapter 24. Lady Bona's house was a narrow, three-story thing wedged between a spice merchant's warehouse and a chapel dedicated to Saint Blaise, its facade plain but its interior rich with tapestries and the scent of beeswax. Theodora followed her new mistress through a courtyard where a fountain murmured, up a flight of stairs, and into a room lined with books, more books than Theodora had ever seen in one place, their leather spines gleaming in the lamplight. Lady Bona sat behind a carved desk and steepled her fingers. "Do you know why I bought you?" Theodora shook her head. Lady Bona smiled. "Because you didn't look away when I looked at you. Most of the others did. They're broken. You're not. Not yet." She leaned forward. "I don't need a maid, Theodora. I need a student." Theodora blinked. "A student?" Lady Bona nodded. "I trade in information, in secrets. And secrets require certain skills." She slid a dagger across the desk, fine, balanced, the hilt inlaid with mother of pearl. "Can you use this?" Theodora picked it up. It felt right in her hand, like an extension of her own bones. "Yes." Lady Bona's smile widened. "Good. Then we'll start tomorrow. Tonight, you eat, you bathe, you sleep. And when you dream of Constantinople if you must. But when you wake, remember, you are Ragusan now." Theodora tightened her grip on the dagger. She was no one's but her own. But for now, for tonight, she could pretend. Chapter 25. The dreams came, as they always did. Her brother's voice, her mother's outstretched hand, the scream of the cannons. Theodora woke with a gasp, the unfamiliar bedclothes tangled around her legs, the pre-dawn light filtering through the shutters. For a moment, she didn't know where she was, then the scent of rosemary and wax reached her, and memory snapped back. Ragusa, Lady Bona, the dagger. She rose, her bare feet silent on the cool tiles, and crossed to the window. Below, the city stirred, the fishermen hauling their catches to market, the night watch trudging home. Somewhere out there, beyond the curve of the horizon, Constantinople smoldered, its streets choked with the dead, its churches defiled. Theodora's throat tightened. She should have died there. Should have died with them. But she hadn't. And now she had a knife, a teacher, and a purpose. Lady Bona's voice echoed in her head. "You are Ragusan now." Theodora smiled, sharp as the blade under her pillow. No, she was Theodora of Constantinople. And one day, she would go home. Chapter 26. The training began at dawn. Lady Bona led Theodora to a rooftop garden where the sea wind kept the air fresh and prying ears at bay. "First lesson," she said, pressing a cup of bitter tea into Theodora's hands. "Everyone lies. Even you." Theodora frowned. "I don't, you do. You tell yourself you're not afraid, that you don't grieve, that you're ready to fight. Lady Bona sipped her own tea. Lies, all of them. And lies make you slow. Theodora's grip tightened on the cup. What do you want from me? The truth, Lady Bona said simply. Start with this. Who do you want to kill? Theodora didn't hesitate. The Sultan. Lady Bona laughed, delighted. Good, honest, impossible, of course. Mehmed is half a world away, surrounded by an army, but honesty is a start. She set down her cup. Now, let's see if you can hold that anger without letting it hold you. Pick up the dagger. Theodora did. The morning sun glinted off the blade, casting a sliver of light across the rooftop, across her face, across the city waking below. Somewhere, a church bell rang. Somewhere, a merchant swore over a spilled crate of saffron. Somewhere, the world went on, as it always did. Theodora took a breath, and began. This response is AI generated, for reference only. Continue. Chapter 27. The dagger became an extension of Theodora's arm over the weeks that followed, its weight as familiar as her own heartbeat as Lady Bona drilled her in forms and footwork until her muscles screamed and her palms blistered. Speed is nothing without precision, the old woman chided as Theodora overextended a lunge for the 10th time that morning, the blade tip quivering just shy of the straw dummy's painted heart. And precision is worthless if your enemy hears you coming. By afternoon, the lessons shifted to less tangible weapons, the arch of an eyebrow, the calculated hesitation before answering a question, the way a well-timed tear could loosen a man's tongue faster than any threat. Lady Bona's network of informants stretched across Ragusa like invisible threads, and Theodora learned to navigate their world with silent feet and sharper ears, collecting whispers of Venetian plots and Ottoman bribes, of pregnancies disguised as illness and debts settled with poison. The city revealed itself to her not as a place of sunlit piazzas and glittering canals, but as a living chessboard where every smile hid a gambit and even the fishmongers knew the price of silence. At night, she traced the scars on her palms, some from training, some from Constantinople, and imagined them as a map leading back to the smoking ruins of her home. Chapter 28. The first test came on a humid evening when Lady Bona tossed Theodora a hooded cloak and a sealed letter. The Albanian shipmaster at the Three Crowns Tavern, she said, her voice barely audible over the sudden downpour rattling the courtyard tiles. He's carrying a cargo of Sicilian sulfur and a message for the Doge's spies. Retrieve the latter without him noticing. Theodora's pulse leapt, but she kept her face still as she tucked the letter into her bodice. A decoy, she guessed, though Lady Bona's expression gave nothing away. The tavern stank of wet wool and sour wine, its common room thick with sailors shouting over dice games and a minstrel's off-key ballad. Theodora spotted the Albanian immediately. A bearish man with a silver capped tooth, his fingers drumming against a leather pouch at his belt as he argued with a Venetian over the price of gunpowder. She ordered a jug of the house's worst wine, cheap enough to justify drinking alone, foul enough to keep others at bay, and let her hood slip as she pretended to fumble with the letter from her bodice, ensuring the shipmaster caught a glimpse of the Doge's seal before she hastily stuffed it away. Within minutes, he loomed over her table. That parchment, he growled, his breath reeking of garlic and greed. Who gave it to you? Theodora let her hand tremble around the wine cup. A man near the docks. He paid me to deliver it tomorrow at dawn. The Albanian's eyes gleamed. Give it to me now, girl, and I'll make it worth your while. She hesitated just long enough to stoke his impatience before surrendering the decoy with a convincing whimper. When he vanished upstairs to examine his prize, she lifted the genuine letter from his pouch, left carelessly on the table in his haste, and slipped into the stormy night, the minstrel's song chasing her out the door. Chapter 29. Lady Bona unfolded the stolen letter with a satisfied hum, her lamplight revealing a cipher of numbers and Greek letters. Adequate, she pronounced, though the corner of her mouth twitched. Though you lingered too long at the door. Never pause to admire your own work. It leaves you vulnerable to those who might be admiring you. She tossed Theodora a small velvet bag heavy with silver coins. "Your first payment. Spend it wisely." Theodora clenched the bag, the metal biting into her palm. In Constantinople, this sum might have bought a bolt of Damascus silk or a year's rent on a modest house. Here, it bought silence, loyalty, a future. She waited until midnight, when the house slept, to bury all but 3 coins beneath the loose floorboard in her room. The remainder she took to the docks at first light, where a one-eyed Cypriot smuggler accepted 2 in exchange for a promise whispered against the roar of the tide, "When you're ready to run, I'll have a boat waiting." The 3rd coin bought a honey cake from a Syrian baker's stall, its sweetness cloying on her tongue as she remembered her brother's laughter, the way he'd always begged for the burnt edges. The taste turned to ash, but she forced herself to swallow every crumb. Sentiment was a luxury she couldn't afford. Chapter 30. Winter carved through Ragusa like a knife, frosting the marble streets and driving the wealthy into their firelit palazzos. Theodora's hands grew rough with chilblains as she shadowed Lady Bona through the icy rituals of high society. The Epiphany Mass where bishops whispered state secrets behind their prayer books, the endless suppers where a dropped napkin could conceal the passing of a bribe. She learned to blend into tapestries and doorways, to refill wine cups just as their contents loosened tongues, to distinguish between the harmless gossip of merchants' wives and the dangerous truths hidden in their complaints about lazy servants or absent husbands. On the solstice, dressed in borrowed velvet, she played the part of a visiting Moldavian noblewoman at the rector's ball, her accent carefully muddled to explain any odd phrasing as she steered a drunken Spanish envoy into confessing his king's plans for Naples. Later, in the frost-laced garden, she pressed her burning forehead against a statue of Mercury and wondered if her mother would recognize her now, this polished creature of lies and lowered lashes. The wind howled through the cypresses, but no ghost answered. Chapter 31. The Albanian shipmaster returned in early spring, his face thunderous as he stormed into Lady Bona's courtyard without announcement. Theodora had half a second to register his presence before he backhanded her across the face hard enough to split her lip. "You thieving bitch," he spat, reaching for his belt knife. "That letter cost me a year's profit." Theodora tasted blood, her body coiled to strike, but Lady Bona's cane came down on the Albanian's wrist with a crack like breaking kindling. "You will not," she said mildly, "draw steel in my home." The man snarled, cradling his injured hand. "She robbed me, and you were fool enough to be robbed." Lady Bona flicked her fingers toward the door. "Consider this a lesson in vigilance. Now get out before I tell the rector about those Ottoman silks you smuggled last autumn." The Albanian paled and fled. Theodora dabbed at her bleeding mouth, her pulse roaring in her ears. Lady Bona sighed and tossed her a handkerchief. "Never let a mark live to resent you, girl. It's sloppy." That night, Theodora added a new entry to the mental ledger she kept: silver cap tooth. Right hand broken. Owe him a knife between the ribs. Chapter 32. The Cypriot smuggler's boat was called the Rising Phoenix, though its peeling paint and patched sails suggested it had yet to live up to the name. Theodora found him mending nets on the moonless night she finally came to collect her debt. "So soon," he teased, his single eye gleaming in the lantern light. "And here I thought you'd grown fond of playing spy." She tossed him the remaining silver from beneath her floorboard. "There's more where this came from. But I need passage east." The smuggler tested a coin between his teeth. "East is Ottoman now, little bird. You sure you want to fly that way?" Theodora thought of Lady Bona's ledgers, fat with secrets about Venetian troop movements and Hungarian gold shipments, all the weapons a clever girl could trade for safe passage through enemy lands. She thought of the Albanian's broken hand, of the way even the mightiest ships burned if you found the right spark. "Just get me to Durazzo," she said. "I'll handle the rest." The smuggler pocketed the silver and spat into the dark water. "We sail with the tide." Chapter 33. Lady Bona was waiting in the courtyard when Theodora returned to gather her things, her face unreadable in the pre-dawn gloom. "I wondered when you'd leave," she said, stirring honey into her tea with deliberate calm. "You've always been too restless for Ragusa." Theodora tightened the straps on her pack. You taught me everything I need. Hardly. The old woman sipped her tea. But I taught you enough to get killed slightly slower than most. She set down the cup and held out a narrow velvet box. Inside lay a dagger, the same mother-of-pearl-hilted one from their first lesson, its edge honed to a murderous gleam. A parting gift. Try not to lose it. Theodora took the blade, then, on impulse, knelt and pressed her forehead to Lady Bona's knuckles in the old Byzantine gesture of respect. The old woman's hand trembled slightly before she pulled away. Go on, then, before I change my mind and sell you to the Venetians. Theodora shouldered her pack and turned toward the docks, where the Phoenix waited. Behind her, Lady Bona called out one last lesson. Remember, girl, vengeance is a dish best served from the shadows. The wind carried her laughter away as the first light of dawn gilded the rooftops of Ragusa, painting them the same bloody gold as the domes of lost Constantinople. Chapter 34. The deck of the rising Phoenix rolled beneath Theodora's feet as Durazzo's harbor faded into the morning mist, the smuggler's crew eyeing her with a mix of curiosity and wariness. She kept to herself, sharpening her new dagger with methodical strokes as the coastline blurred into a smudge of green and brown. Somewhere beyond those hills lay the overgrown bones of the Egnatian Way, the ancient road that had once carried Roman legions east, and would now carry her. The Cypriot dropped onto the crate beside her, offering a wineskin of something that smelled like turpentine. To your health, he said with a grin. Theodora took a token sip and handed it back. How long to Durazzo? 3 days, if the wind favors us. He studied her face. You got people waiting. She ran her thumb along the dagger's edge, drawing a bead of blood. No, she lied. No one at all. Chapter 35. The road to Thessalonica was thick with refugees and Ottoman patrols, the air buzzing with flies and rumors. The Sultan was marching on Belgrade, the Venetians were massing ships in Corfu, a pretender to the Byzantine throne had been seen in Trebizond. Theodora moved through the chaos like a shadow, her Greek flavored with a ragus and lilt when questioned, her stolen peasant garb concealing the knives strapped to her thighs. At a lice-infested inn near the Vardar River, she traded a day's labor scrubbing pots for a place by the kitchen fire and a whispered conversation with the innkeeper's daughter. They say the Sultan's building a new palace in Constantinople, the girl confided as she kneaded dough, her fingers quickened. Sure, with towers so high you can see all the way to Mecca. Theodora scrubbed harder at the burnt stew pot. And the people, the ones who survived. The girl shrugged. Some converted, some fled, most just disappeared. She lowered her voice. But my cousin says there's a man in the ruins of the Blashenai who helps Christians escape. They call him the ghost of Byzantium. Theodora's breath caught. A fantasy, surely, but what if? That night, she added a new destination to her mental map, her fingers tracing the route east along the crumbling highways of empire. Chapter 36. The ghost of Byzantium smelled of old wine and rotting teeth, his once fine robes patched with rough wool, his left leg dragging as he limped through the rubble of the Blachenay's shattered chapel. Theodora watched from the shadows for 3 nights before approaching, tracking his routine, dawn prayers amid the ruins, afternoons bargaining with Turkish guards for the release of prisoners, nights smuggling those same prisoners down to Genoese fishing boats in the Golden Horn. On the 4th night, she stepped into his path as he returned alone from the docks, her dagger glinting in the moonlight. You're either very brave or very stupid, the ghost wheezed, unimpressed. Skulking around here after curfew. Theodora sheathed her blade. I heard you help people escape. The old man snorted. I help those worth helping. What are you? Some Venetians by blow looking for a way home. She drew herself up. I'm Theodora of Constantinople. For the first time, the ghost's eyes sharpened. He fumbled in his robes and produced a cracked oil lamp, holding it up to her face. Christ's teeth, he breathed. You look just like her. Theodora went very still. Like who? The lamplight guttered as the wind picked up, casting wild shadows across the ruins. The ghost's smile was a terrible thing. Like your mother, girl. Welcome home. Chapter 37. The cellar beneath the ruined chapel stank of damp and desperation, its walls lined with makeshift pallets where a dozen fugitives huddled, women clutching silent children, old men with vacant stares, a half-mad nun who rocked back and forth chanting the liturgy. The ghost shoved a wineskin into Theodora's hands. "Drink. You look like you've seen a ghost." She took a gulp of vinegary liquid, her mind reeling. "You knew my mother." I, brave woman, held off 3 janissaries with a fireplace poker so you and the boy could run. He spat into the dirt. "Died well." Theodora's vision blurred. She hadn't realized until this moment how desperately she'd hoped. "And my brother?" The ghost's face darkened. "The Turks took the children. Some to the Sultan's schools, some to the slave markets. No way to know which." He gripped her shoulder, his fingers like talons. "But you're a gift from God. We've been waiting for someone like you." Around them, the fugitives stirred, their eyes reflecting the lamplight like a pack of starving wolves. Theodora wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Waiting for what? The ghost's grin showed too many teeth. For the reckoning. Chapter 38. The plan was madness. Theodora saw that immediately as the ghost unrolled a stained map of the city, his gnarled finger tracing routes through sewer tunnels and half-collapsed aqueducts. "The Sultan's hosting a banquet in the Great Palace next month," he whispered, his breath foul with decay. "All his generals, all his viziers, 1,000 men drunk on victory and wine. We slip in through the old hypocaust, plant the Greek fire in the cellars, you'll burn 1,000 men alive," Theodora interrupted, her voice flat. The ghost's eyes gleamed. "And save 1,000,000 more from tyranny." Around them, the fugitives murmured agreement, their faces gaunt with hunger and hate. Theodora studied the map, the palace, the tunnels, the escape route to the sea. It could work, or it could get them all impaled on the city walls. She thought of her brother, of the chance, however slim, that he still lived in some Ottoman school or slave pen. Thought of Lady Bona's voice hissing, "Vengeance is a dish best served from the shadows." "No," she said at last, rolling up the map. "We do it my way." Chapter 39. The janissary barracks stank of sweat and leather, the air thick with the snores of 100 sleeping soldiers. Theodora moved through the darkness like a breath, her bare feet silent on the straw-strewn floor, her stolen uniform just a shade too large. The commander's quarters lay at the far end, guarded by a single yawning sentry, a boy no older than she was, his chin dotted with the first attempt at a beard. She waited until he turned to adjust his belt before slipping past, her pulse steady, her fingers curled around the vial of poppy syrup she'd traded 2 silver buttons for in the bazaar. The commander slept sprawled across his cot, his mouth open, a half-empty bottle of raki by his bedside. Theodora hesitated for only a heartbeat before emptying the vial into the bottle, watching the thick liquid swirl into the liquor. Not enough to kill, just enough to make him sleep through tomorrow's muster. One less officer to oversee the Sultan's banquet. One small crack in the Empire's armor. She retreated as silently as she'd come, pausing only to lift the commander's seal ring from his discarded robe. The sentry was still fumbling with his belt as she melted back into the night. Chapter 40. Dawn found Theodora kneeling in the ruins of the Horror Monastery, her forehead pressed against the one mosaic the Turks had missed, a tiny, surviving fragment of the Virgin's blue robe. Around her, the city woke to another day of occupation, the call to prayer echoing from 100 minarets that had once been bell towers, the clatter of carts carrying stone for the Sultan's new palace, the distant laughter of Turkish children playing in the streets that had run red with Greek blood 3 years before. The ghost would call her weak for what she'd done, or rather, hadn't done, last night. But Theodora had seen enough of war to know that fire only bred more fire. She touched the dagger at her belt, the one Lady Bona had given her, its hilt cool against her fingertips. Somewhere in this broken city, her brother might still live. Somewhere in the Sultan's court, there were men who remembered the taste of Christian blood. And somewhere in the shadows between them, Theodora would find her revenge, not in a blaze of Greek fire, but one slow, silent cut at a time. The sun climbed higher, gilding the ruins, and she rose to meet it. Chapter 41. The banquet was everything the ghost had promised, a sea of silk and jewels flooding the great palace's triclinium, the air thick with the scent of roasted lamb and the cloying sweetness of baklava. Theodora moved through the crowd with a serving tray balanced on one hand, her headscarf concealing her face, her stolen uniform marking her as just another anonymous kitchen slave. No one looked twice at the girl refilling their wine cups, no one noticed when she lingered near the high table where Mehmed himself held court, resplendent in a gold-embroidered kaftan, his sharp features softened by wine and victory. Theodora's fingers itched for the knife strapped to her thigh, but she forced herself to breathe, to wait, to watch as the Sultan laughed at some jest from his Grand Vizier. This close, he looked younger than she'd imagined, his beard barely thicker than her own brother's might be now, if he lived. The thought sent a jolt through her, and she nearly missed the signal, a dropped napkin from the Venetian envoy. 2 tables over, steadying her hands, Theodora edged toward the indicated pillar where a folded scrap of parchment had been tucked between the stones. The exchange took less than a heartbeat, the note vanishing into her sleeve as she continued her rounds, her pulse hammering. It wasn't until she reached the kitchens that she dared to unfold the message, her eyes scanning the cramped Italian script, shipment of Hungarian arms diverted to Edirne. Guard rotation changed, ghost's plan compromised. Theodora crushed the paper in her fist. So the Venetians had spies among the rebels too. She should have expected it. The heat of the ovens pressed against her back as she weighed her options. Warn the ghost and risk walking into a trap, or abandon the old fanatic to his fate. A kitchen slave jostled past her with a tray of sweets, and in that moment, Theodora made her choice. She would play the game Lady Bona had taught her, not the ghost's bloody crusade. Slipping out the servants' entrance, she melted into the labyrinth of palace corridors, her mind already racing ahead to the next move, the next betrayal, the next fragile step toward finding what remained of her family in this graveyard of empires. The night air outside smelled of jasmine and gunpowder, a fitting perfume for a city forever balanced between beauty and violence. Somewhere in the darkness, a dog barked, and Theodora vanished into the shadows, her path uncertain but her purpose clear at last. Chapter 42. The safe house near the Eleutherian harbor reeked of fish and damp wool, its single room lit by a guttering tallow candle that painted the ghost's face in grotesque shadows. He looked up sharply as Theodora entered, his hand flying to the knife at his belt before recognition dawned. "You're late," he growled, kicking aside a pile of moldy blankets to reveal a trapdoor. "The Venetians sold us out. We moved tonight." Theodora didn't budge. "Sold you out, you mean? I was never part of your suicide pact." The old man's lips peeled back from yellowed teeth. "Then why are you here?" She tossed the Venetian's note at his feet. "Because we both want the same thing, survival. And right now, that means getting your people out before the Janissaries come knocking." The ghost stared at her for a long moment, then barked a laugh. "Christ, you're her daughter all right." He yanked open the trapdoor, revealing a narrow tunnel slick with algae. "Lead the way, girl. Let's see if you're as clever as your mother." Theodora hesitated at the edge of the darkness, the stench of stagnant water rising to greet her. Somewhere in that blackness lay the bones of the city she'd loved, the ghosts of the people she'd lost. She took a deep breath and stepped into the void. Chapter 43. The tunnel spat out near the old Neorian harbor, its waters black under a moonless sky. The ghost's refugees huddled on the rotting docks like a flock of bedraggled crows, their eyes wide with terror as the sound of marching boots echoed from the streets above. Theodora counted heads quickly, 12, including the mad nun and a pair of twins who couldn't be more than 5. No boat waited at the appointed spot. "Your Genoese friends are late," she hissed at the ghost. The old man squinted at the horizon. "They'll come," a child whimpered, and Theodora's patience snapped. She grabbed the ghost's arm, her fingers digging into his wasted muscle. "If they don't, we're all dead. And I didn't survive Constantinople just to die in a Turkish rat trap." Before he could answer, a soft whistle cut through the darkness, 3 short, too long. Theodora's breath caught. That wasn't the signal the ghost had described. She reached for her knife just as a familiar figure materialized from the shadows, the Cypriot smuggler, his one eye gleaming. In the starlight, "Little bird," he murmured, "looks like you need a boat after all." Behind him, the rising phoenix floated like a phantom, its sails furled, its deck eerily silent. The ghost stiffened. "Who the hell is this?" Theodora exhaled sharply. "Our way out." She met the smuggler's gaze. "Price?" He grinned. "Same as last time, plus interest." The marching boots grew louder. Theodora made a decision. Everyone aboard, now. As the refugees scrambled up the gangplank, the ghost grabbed her wrist. "This isn't over, girl. The fight goes on." Theodora pried his fingers away. "Not my fight," she lied, and followed the others into the waiting dark. Chapter 44. The deck of the rising phoenix rolled beneath Theodora's feet as Constantinople's skyline faded into the dawn, its minarets and half-rebuilt walls gilded by a sun that no longer felt like hers. The ghost's refugees huddled amidships, their faces turned toward a horizon they'd never expected to see. The Cypriot sidled up beside her, offering a wineskin. "Where to now, little bird?" Theodora took a long pull of the vinegary liquid, letting it burn away the taste of loss and lingering doubt. "Venice," she said at last. The smuggler raised an eyebrow. "You sure? Lot of Turks in Venice these days. Lot of eyes." She handed back the wineskin and adjusted the weight of the dagger at her belt. "Exactly." The wind shifted, filling the sails, carrying the ship, and Theodora, west toward the heart of the enemy's web. Behind them, the first call to prayer echoed across the water, a sound that was neither dirge nor triumph, but something in between, the sound of a world changed forever, and a girl who refused to be part of its forgetting. The sun climbed higher, the waves slapped against the hull, and Theodora of Constantinople set her face against the wind and did not look back. Chapter 45. Venice rose from the lagoon like a mirage, its palazzos glowing pink in the sunset, its canals choked with gondolas and garbage. Theodora paid the Cypriot with the last of Lady Bona's silver and a promise she had no intention of keeping, then vanished into the maze of alleys behind the Rialto, her hood pulled low against the drizzle. The city teemed with Ottomans, merchants haggling over spices, scholars debating in coffeehouses, diplomats strutting through Piazza San Marco in their embroidered caftans. No one noticed another foreign girl slipping through the crowds, her hands tucked into her sleeves to hide their trembling. The safe house was where the Venetian envoy's note had said it would be, a crumbling building near the arsenal, its door marked with a faded cross scratched into the wood. Theodora knocked twice, paused, then 3 times more. The slot slid open, revealing a single bloodshot eye. "Password," a voice rasped. She took a deep breath and spoke the words she'd carried across 2 seas, "The eagle flies at midnight." The door creaked open, and Theodora stepped into the dim interior where a dozen faces turned toward her, Greek, Venetian, Serbian, all united by loss and the hunger for revenge. At the head of the table sat a man with a familiar gold-capped tooth. The Albanian shipmaster grinned. "Welcome to the resistance." Chapter 46. The Albanian's warehouse stank of salt and rotting wood, its rafters hung with nets and rusted chains. Theodora followed him through the gloom, her fingers brushing the hilt of her dagger as he gestured to a map of the Adriatic pinned to the wall. "Mehmed's sending an envoy to Rome next month," he said, tracing the route with a grimy fingernail. "Some groveling plea for recognition from the Pope." He spat on the floor. "We sink that ship, and the Sultan loses face from here to Jerusalem." Theodora studied the map, her mind working. "You don't have the men for that." "Not yet." The Albanian's smile showed too many teeth. "But with the right leverage, we could convince the Doge to look the other way." He leaned closer, his breath reeking of onions and bad wine. "That's where you come in, girl. Rumor says you were Lady Bona's pet. That you know where she keeps her blackmail ledgers." Theodora went very still. So that was his play. She forced a laugh. "If I had that, I wouldn't be standing in this piss-stinking warehouse." The Albanian's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist hard enough to bruise. Don't play coy with me, Greek. You want the Turks to pay. This is how. Around them, the shadows seemed to shift and breathe. Theodora weighed her options: play along and walk into a trap, or refuse and make an enemy of the only allies she had left. She twisted her arm free with a move Lady Bona had taught her and smiled. Fine, but we do it my way. The Albanian's laughter followed her out into the rain-slick streets, where the bells of San Marco tolled the hour, their echoes drowning the sound of her footsteps as she disappeared into the city's hungry heart. Chapter 47. The house near the Ghetto Nuovo was smaller than Lady Bona's, its facade plain, its windows shuttered against prying eyes. Theodora knocked in the old Ragusan pattern, 2 quick, 3 slow, and held her breath until the door cracked open to reveal a familiar face. "You're late," Lady Bona said, stepping aside to let her in. The interior was all rich velvets and hidden compartments, the air scented with lavender and something darker, sharper. Theodora exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. "You knew I'd come." Lady Bona poured 2 glasses of something amber and expensive. "I knew you weren't stupid enough to die in Constantinople." She handed Theodora a glass. "The Albanian's using you, you realize." Theodora took a sip, letting the warmth spread through her chest. "I know, and you're using him, obviously." Lady Bona's lips curved. "Good girl." She crossed to a hidden panel in the wall and withdrew a ledger bound in black leather. "Here, everything you need to bring Venice to its knees." Theodora didn't reach for it. "What's the price?" The old woman's smile faded. "You don't come back." The words hung between them, heavier than the ledger, sharper than the dagger at Theodora's belt. Outside, the rain picked up, tapping against the shutters like impatient fingers. Theodora set down her glass and took the book. "I was never planning to." Chapter 48. The Albanian's face when Theodora tossed the ledger onto the table was worth every mile she'd traveled, every lie she'd told. He lunged for it like a starving man at a feast, his fingers trembling as he flipped through the pages. "Christ and all his saints," he breathed. "This is everything," Theodora interrupted. "Names, dates, bribes, murders. Enough to sink half the Council of 10. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Now, my terms." The Albanian's eyes gleamed. "Name them." The envoy's ship sails untouched. "We hit something bigger." She tapped a page in the ledger, an entry detailing the Doge's secret dealings with Mehmed's Grand Vizier. "We give Venice a choice: stand with us against the Turks, or watch their precious republic burn." The Albanian's grin was terrifying. "You don't think small, do you, girl?" Theodora thought of her brother's face, her mother's last words, the ghost's broken crusade. She thought of Constantinople's walls crumbling under cannon fire, of Ragus's gilded lies, of the way the world kept turning no matter how many grades it took to grease the wheels. "No," she said softly. "I don't." Outside, the bells began to toll, their voices shaking the dust from the rafters, the sound rolling across the lagoon like thunder, like warning, like the first note of a war only Theodora could see coming. Chapter 49. The Doge's palace stank of incense and fear, its gilded halls lined with guards who gripped their halberds too tightly as Theodora followed the Albanian through the maze of corridors. The ledger weighed heavy in her hands, its secrets humming against her palms like live coals. They were ushered into a chamber where the Doge himself waited, his face a mask of practiced calm, his rings glittering in the lamplight. "So," he said, his voice dry as parchment, "the viper returns to the nest." The Albanian bowed, but Theodora stood straight, meeting the old man's gaze without flinching. "We have an offer," she said, and laid the ledger on the table between them. The Doge didn't touch it. "Blackmail is a dangerous game, child. So is betrayal," Theodora countered. "Your deals with the Ottomans. The gold you took to look the other way while they sacked Christian cities." She flipped the ledger open to a marked page. "How long do you think Venice will stand when the Pope learns of this?" The Doge's jaw tightened. "What do you want?" Theodora smiled. Ships, soldiers, a message to Rome. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. And the name, every child taken from Constantinople after the fall. Every slave, every convert, every hostage in Mehmed's court. The old man studied her for a long moment, his eyes dark with something that might have been pity. "You'll never find them all," he said softly. Theodora straightened, her hand resting on her dagger. "Try me." Chapter 50. The arsenal was chaos at dawn, the docks swarming with carpenters and caulkers, the air thick with the stink of pitch and sweat. Theodora stood at the edge of the fray, watching as the first of the Doge's promised ships was fitted for war, its hull reinforced, its oar ports widened, its decks cleared for the cannons that would soon bristle along its sides. The Albanian clapped her on the shoulder, his breath reeking of last night's wine. "We did it, girl. Venice is with us." Theodora shrugged him off. "Venice is saving its own skin." She turned away from the spectacle, her eyes scanning the crowd until she found what she was looking for, a slight figure in a scribe's robe, his head bent over a ledger of his own. She approached slowly, giving him time to see her coming. "You're the archivist." The man looked up, his eyes widening at the dagger on her belt. "Why yes." Theodora handed him a scrap of parchment. "These names. I need everything you have." The scribe unfolded the paper, his lips moving silently as he read. When he looked up again, his expression had changed. "These are children," Theodora finished. "From Constantinople." The scribe hesitated, then nodded toward a door at the back of the warehouse. "Come with me." The room beyond was small and windowless, its walls lined with shelves of dusty ledgers. The scribe pulled one down, blowing off a cloud of dust. "The Turks keep meticulous records," he murmured, flipping pages. "Every slave, every tribute, every convert." He stopped on a page filled with cramped Arabic script, his finger tracing a line. "Here, a boy, 9 years old, taken in the first sack. Sent to Edirne for schooling." Theodora's breath caught. "Name." The scribe squinted at the writing. "It says, Demetrios." The world tilted. Theodora gripped the edge of the table, her vision swimming. Demetrios. Her brother's name. Her brother, alive. The scribe was still talking, but his voice seemed to come from very far away. "There's more, a list of others taken that day, where they were sent, whether they." Theodora snatched the ledger from his hands, her eyes scanning the page, drinking in every word, every clue, every fragile thread that might lead her home. Outside, the cannons roared as Venice prepared for war, but all Theodora heard was the sound of her own heart, pounding out a single word: alive. Chapter 51. The road to Edirne was thick with Ottoman supply trains, the fields trampled by the passage of thousands of men and horses heading north toward the Hungarian frontier. Theodora moved through the chaos like a ghost, her stolen Turkish garb and rudimentary Arabic enough to pass casual inspection, her eyes constantly scanning for the telltale red hats of the Sultan's elite troops. The scribe's ledger weighed heavy in her pack, its pages filled with names and fates. Demetrios of Constantinople, sent to Edirne's imperial school in 1453, last noted as a scribe in the palace archives. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had in years. At a caravansary near Philippopolis, she shared a fire with a group of Armenian merchants who spoke freely once they decided she was harmless. "The Sultan's gathering an army like the world's never seen," one confided, his voice low. "They say he means to take Rome itself." Another laughed. "Let him try. The Italians will piss themselves and surrender before he crosses the Po." Theodora poked at the fire with a stick, her face carefully blank. "And the court, who rules while the Sultan's at war?" The merchants exchanged glances. "Grand Vizier Mahmud, they say." With the eunuchs whispering in his ear, one leaned closer, his breath sour with raki. "But the real power's the Sultan's mother. That woman could teach the devil a trick or two." The fire crackled, sending up a shower of sparks. Theodora filed the information away, her mind already turning it over, looking for weak points and opportunities. Chapter 52. Edirne's skyline rose from the Thracian plains like a promise, or a threat, its minarets piercing the low-hanging clouds, the domes of the imperial mosques gleaming even in the dull afternoon light. Theodora adjusted the wrap covering her hair and joined the stream of merchants, pilgrims, and petitioners flowing through the city's massive gates. The guards barely glanced at her, too busy harassing a group of Armenian traders for their permits. Inside, the city was a labyrinth of narrow streets and bustling markets, the air thick with the scent of roasting meat, incense, and the ever-present undercurrent of animal dung. She moved with purpose, her steps leading her toward the oldest quarter of the city, where the imperial school stood adjacent to the palace complex. The scribe in Venice had been vague about Demetrios's current whereabouts, only that he had been assigned to the archives after completing his education. It was a start. Chapter 53. The archives were housed in a low, unassuming building tucked behind the Grand Vizier's offices, its entrance guarded by a pair of bored-looking janissaries. Theodora observed them from the shadow of a nearby awning, noting the way they perked up only when a high-ranking official passed by. She waited until the call to prayer echoed through the streets, then slipped forward as the guards straightened to attention for a passing imam. "I have a delivery for the head archivist," she said in her best servant's Turkish, holding up a wrapped bundle she'd prepared earlier, a few blank parchments and a pot of ink bought from the market. The younger guard waved her through with a grunt. Inside, the archives were cool and dim, the air thick with the scent of parchment and dust. Rows of shelves stretched into the gloom, each laden with scrolls and bound volumes. A thin man with a wispy beard looked up from a desk near the back, his eyes narrowing. "Yes." Theodora bowed her head. "Delivery, Effendi." She placed the bundle on the edge of his desk, letting her gaze flick over the stacks of documents nearby. "Where should I put it?" He sighed and gestured vaguely to a side table. "There, now go." She hesitated, then risked a question. "Is there a Demetrios here? I was told to give him something as well." The archivist's expression shifted, something like suspicion, or perhaps caution. "Demetrios." He studied her for a long moment. "He doesn't work in this section." Theodora's pulse quickened. "Where, then?" The man's lips thinned. "Who sent you?" Before she could answer, a voice cut in from behind her, smooth, amused, and horribly familiar. "That's what I'd like to know." Chapter 54. Theodora turned slowly, her hand drifting toward the knife hidden in her sash. The man standing in the doorway was taller than she remembered, his lean frame draped in the fine robes of a palace official, his dark hair threaded with the first hints of silver. But his eyes, those hadn't changed. They were still the same clear gray as her own. Demetrios, her brother, alive. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to just the two of them, the archives fading into a blur. Then his expression hardened, and the moment shattered. "You shouldn't be here," he said in flawless Turkish, his voice low and urgent. The archivist frowned. "You know this woman, Demetrios?" Demetrios didn't take his eyes off her. "No, but I'll handle this." He grabbed Theodora's arm, too tightly to be friendly, and steered her toward a side door. She let him, her mind racing. He had recognized her, and yet, the door clicked shut behind them, plunging them into a narrow, windowless corridor. Demetrios released her arm and stepped back, his face unreadable. "You're supposed to be dead." Theodora swallowed against the sudden tightness in her throat. "So are you." Chapter 55. The room Demetrios led her to was small and sparsely furnished. A scholar's cell, with a narrow cot, a desk piled high with scrolls, and a single oil lamp casting flickering shadows on the walls. He locked the door behind them, then turned to face her, his arms crossed. "Why are you here?" Theodora studied him, the careful way he held himself, the new lines around his eyes, the faint scar along his jaw. He wasn't the boy she remembered. But then, she wasn't the girl he'd left behind, either. "I came to find you," she said simply. Demetrios exhaled sharply. "That's a mistake." He paced to the desk, his back to her. "You need to leave, now." Theodora didn't move. "Not without you." He turned, his expression incredulous. "You think I'm a prisoner?" That you can just, what? Rescue me. His laugh was bitter. I'm a scribe, Theodora. A valued one. I have a place here. A life. She stepped forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. As a convert, his jaw tightened. As a survivor, the silence between them stretched, taut as a bowstring. Outside, the distant sounds of the city filtered through the walls, the call of a street vendor, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the ever-present murmur of voices. Theodora took another step. Mother's dead. Demetrios flinched. I know. And father died in the first assault. He looked away. I was taken straight to Edirne. They thought I was noble-born, worth educating. Theodora's hands curled into fists. And you just let them. His gaze snapped back to hers, sharp as a blade. What choice did I have? She had no answer for that. None that wouldn't cut them both. Chapter 56. The truth, when it came, was worse than she'd imagined. Demetrios had not just survived, he had thrived. His talent for languages and numbers had earned him a place in the Sultan's bureaucracy, his rise steady if unremarkable. He had taken a Turkish name, Yusuf, and though he hadn't formally converted, he prayed in the mosque when it was expected and kept his head down. It's not so bad, he said, pouring her a cup of weak tea. The Sultan values skill over blood. And the archives, I've read things most scholars only dream of. Theodora stared at him. Your content. It wasn't a question. Demetrios met her gaze. I'm alive. The words hung between them, heavy with all the things they couldn't say, all the years, the losses, the choices that had brought them here. Theodora set down her cup, her fingers trembling. Come with me. He shook his head. I can't. You mean you won't? Demetrios sighed. Theodora, be reasonable. Where would I go? What would I do? I'm not. He broke off, but she heard the unspoken words anyway. I'm not like you. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. Fine. Then I'll go alone. He caught her wrist as she turned. Wait. For a moment, she thought he might change his mind. Then he reached into his robe and withdrew a small, folded parchment. Take this. It's a list, names of others like me. Others who might want what you're offering. Theodora took it, her throat tight. And you? Demetrios's smile was sad. I made my choice a long time ago. Outside, the call to prayer began again, the sound rising and falling like a tide. Theodora tucked the parchment into her sash and turned toward the door. She didn't look back. Chapter 57. The streets of Edirne were quieter now, the markets closing as the sun dipped below the horizon. Theodora moved quickly, her mind still reeling from the encounter, her chest aching as if she'd been struck. She had found her brother, alive, whole, successful, and it had somehow hurt more than finding his corpse would have. A part of her wanted to scream, to rage, to burn the city down around her. But another part, the colder, harder part that had kept her alive this long, whispered that this changed nothing. She still had the list. She still had a war to fight. She ducked into an alley to check the names Demetrios had given her, her fingers clumsy with suppressed emotion. The script was neat, precise, his hand. She scanned the list quickly, committing the details to memory. 3 scribes in the palace, 2 translators, a physician, a handful of servants, all former Byzantines, all with access to information, all potential allies. Or traitors. She tucked the parchment away and stepped back into the street, straight into the path of a janissary patrol. Chapter 58. The captain of the patrol was a grizzled veteran with a nose that had been broken one too many times. He eyed Theodora with open suspicion. You're out late. She bowed her head, slipping back into her servant's persona. Apologies, Effendi. I was sent to fetch medicine for my mistress. The janissary's gaze dropped to her sash, where the edge of Demetrios's list peeked out. What's that? Theodora's blood turned to ice. Nothing, just. He snatched it from her before she could react, unfolding it with a frown. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought it was over. Then the captain snorted and shoved it back at her. Love letters. Really? Theodora blinked. She risked a glance at the parchment, and nearly laughed. The ink had smudged in her sweaty grip, rendering most of the names illegible. Only a few scattered words remained visible, innocuous enough to pass for a romantic missive. She ducked her head again, forcing a blush. My sweetheart works in the palace." The janissary rolled his eyes and waved her on. "Go on, then, but be quicker next time." Theodora didn't need telling twice. She hurried away, her heart pounding, the crumpled list clutched in her fist. Demetrios had saved her, again. She wasn't sure whether to thank him or curse him for it. Chapter 59. The caravansary was nearly empty at this hour, most of its occupants either asleep or out in the city's taverns. Theodora paid the keeper for another night and retreated to her rented pallet, her mind still churning. She smoothed out Demetrios's list as best she could, but the damage was done. Only a handful of names were still readable. Enough to work with, perhaps, but not enough to build an army. Not that it mattered now. The encounter with the janissary had been too close. Edirne wasn't safe anymore. She needed to move on. But to where, and to what end? She lay back on the thin mattress, staring up at the cracked ceiling. For years, finding Demetrios had been her goal, the thing that kept her moving, fighting, surviving. Now that she had, what was left? Revenge. A hollow substitute for a family. Rebellion. A fool's errand against an empire that had already won. Theodora closed her eyes, exhaustion pressing down on her like a physical weight. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, once, twice, then fell silent. Chapter 60. Dawn found Theodora on the road again, her few possessions bundled into a worn satchel, her dagger strapped to her thigh where she could reach it quickly. She had bought a place with a merchant caravan heading south toward Gallipoli, away from Edirne, away from Demetrios, away from the ghosts that haunted her. The merchant, a garrulous Syrian with a fondness for bad jokes, had assured her the journey would take less than a week. And then, where to? He asked as they rumbled through the city gates. Theodora watched Edirne's walls recede in the distance, her brother's smudged list burning a hole in her pocket. "I don't know," she said truthfully. The merchant laughed. "Ah, the best kind of journey." He flicked the reins, urging the oxen forward. "Adventure awaits." Theodora didn't answer. She wasn't sure she believed in adventures anymore. But as the caravan rolled on, the rising sun painting the road ahead in shades of gold and crimson, she allowed herself a small, grim smile. She was alive, and for now, that was enough. Chapter 61. The weeks blurred together as Theodora drifted from city to city, Gallipoli, Bursa, Smyrna, each one a way station on a road that seemed to lead nowhere. She took odd jobs where she could find them, mending sails for fishermen, translating letters for merchants, even, once, assisting a drunken Italian surgeon with an amputation. The pay was meager, but it kept her fed and moving, which was all she asked. In Smyrna, she heard rumors of a Byzantine pretender gathering forces in the Morea, a cousin of the last emperor, some said, or a bastard son. The stories varied, but the hope in the tellers' voices didn't. Theodora listened, asked careful questions, and filed the information away. It might be nothing, but then again, she was sitting in a dockside tavern, picking at a plate of stale bread and olives, when a shadow fell across her table. "Mind if I join you?" The voice was familiar, though it took her a moment to place it. She looked up, and nearly choked on her wine. The Cypriot smuggler grinned down at her, his one eye gleaming in the lamplight. "Fancy meeting you here, little bird." Chapter 62. The rising phoenix hadn't improved in Theodora's absence. Its decks were still patched, its sails still frayed, its crew still a motley assortment of cutthroats and fugitives. But it was, undeniably, a way out. The Cypriot leaned against the rail beside her, watching as Smyrna's harbor faded into the twilight. "So," he said, "still running?" Theodora didn't look at him. "Still following me?" He laughed. Call it professional curiosity. You're the most interesting thing to happen to me in years. She shot him a sidelong glance. That's sad, isn't it just? He stretched, his joints popping. Where to, then? Back to Venice, Constantinople, somewhere new. Theodora hesitated. The rumors of the Byzantine pretender tugged at her. A siren call she wasn't sure she trusted. But what else did she have? The Moria, she said at last. The smuggler raised an eyebrow. Rebel country. Dangerous. She met his gaze evenly. I'm dangerous too. He grinned. That you are. He pushed off the rail and sauntered toward the helm, calling orders to his crew. Theodora turned back to the sea, the wind tugging at her hair like an impatient lover. Somewhere to the west, a spark of resistance flickered. And she, Theodora of Constantinople, sister of a traitor, daughter of a dead empire, would see if it could be kindled into flame. Chapter 63. The Pretender's camp was a ragged collection of tents and lean-tos tucked into the hills above Mistras, its perimeter guarded by a handful of hard-eyed men with mismatched weapons and the desperate air of those with nothing left to lose. Theodora observed them from a distance for 2 days before approaching, noting the routines, the weak points, the way the sentry's attention wandered after the midnight watch change. On the third night, she slipped past them with ease, her footsteps silent on the rocky ground. The pretender himself was younger than she'd expected, no more than 25, with the sharp features and golden hair of the Paleologos line. He sat by a meager fire, surrounded by a handful of advisors, their voices low and urgent. Theodora waited in the shadows until one of the sentries passed, then stepped into the firelight. "You're smaller than I expected," she said in her clearest Greek. The pretender's head snapped up, his hand flying to his sword. His companions were less restrained, one lunged at her with a dagger, another scrambled backward with a curse. Theodora sidestepped the attack easily and held up her empty hands. "I come alone, and I come to help." The pretender studied her, his gaze sharp. "Who are you?" She smiled. "The ghost of Constantinople." Chapter 64. The pretender's name was Alexios, and his claim to the throne was tenuous at best, a distant relation to the last emperor, a childhood spent in exile in Trebizond, a handful of loyalists who remembered his family's name. But he was charismatic, clever, and just desperate enough to listen when Theodora laid out her proposal. "You'll never take Constantinople with swords alone," she said, tracing a map in the dirt with her dagger. "But information, that's a weapon even the Sultan can't defend against." Alexios's advisor, a grizzled old general missing an eye, snorted. "Spies won't win a war, girl." Theodora didn't blink. "They already have." She listed names, dates, weaknesses, everything she'd learned in Ragusa, everything Demetrios had unwittingly revealed. The Ottomans' supply routes, the discontent among the Janissaries, the Venetian duplicity. By the time she finished, even the old general looked thoughtful. Alexios leaned forward, his eyes bright. "And what do you want in return?" Theodora met his gaze. "A place at your side. And when Constantinople is yours." She let the words hang, heavy with promise. Alexios smiled. It wasn't a kind expression. "Welcome to the rebellion, Theodora of Constantinople." Chapter 65. The months that followed were a blur of movement and intrigue. Secret meetings in mountain passes, coded messages passed in crowded marketplaces, the slow, patient work of turning rumor into rebellion. Theodora became Alexios's shadow, her knowledge of Ottoman operations and Venetian double-dealing proving invaluable. She taught his men how to move unseen, how to extract information from prisoners without leaving marks, how to turn an enemy's own greed against them. The old general, whose name she learned was Nikephoros, grudgingly admitted she had a talent for war. "Pity you weren't born a man," he said one evening as they prepared an ambush on an Ottoman supply train. Theodora tested the edge of her dagger and smiled. "No, it isn't." The attack went smoothly, too smoothly. The supply train was lightly guarded, the wagons full of grain and weapons, the kind of prize that could sustain a rebellion for months. But as Theodora moved through the carnage, something nagged at her. The guards had been expecting them. One, dying in the dirt, gasped out a warning with his last breath, "Trap. Mistress." Her blood turned to ice. Chapter 66. They rode for Mistress at a breakneck pace, the stolen supplies abandoned, the wounded left behind. Theodora's mind raced. Who had betrayed them? How much did the Ottomans know? Alexios's face was grim, his knuckles white on the reins. If they've taken the camp, they haven't, Theodora cut in, though she had no way of knowing. They arrived to find the camp burning. The tents were reduced to smoldering ruins, the bodies of rebels and Ottomans alike strewn across the rocky ground. Theodora dismounted before her horse had fully stopped, her dagger drawn, her eyes scanning for survivors. Nikephoros lay near what had been the command tent, his remaining eye staring blankly at the sky. Alexios let out a strangled cry and dropped to his knees beside him. Theodora kept moving, her senses alert for any sign of movement. A groan led her to a half-collapsed lean-to, where a young rebel clutched a bloody wound in his side. The Venetians, he gasped when he saw her. They led them here. Theodora's stomach twisted. Of course, she should have known. She turned back to Alexios, who cradled Nikephoros' body like a child. "We need to go, now." He didn't move. "Alexios," she snapped. "They'll be back with reinforcements. If we don't go then," he said quietly. "Run, like you always do." The words stung more than they should have. Theodora straightened, her jaw set. "I'm not the one who let myself be betrayed." Alexios looked up at last, his eyes red-rimmed and furious. "Get out." For a moment, she considered arguing. Then the distant sound of hoofbeats decided for her. She turned on her heel and vanished into the gathering dusk, the smell of smoke and blood clinging to her clothes. Chapter 67. The Cypriot was waiting at the rendezvous point, just as she'd hoped he would be. He took one look at her singed hair and smoke-stained clothes and wordlessly handed her a flask of something strong enough to make her eyes water. Theodora drank deeply, then wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "How did you know?" He shrugged. "Call it a hunch. Saw Venetian colors flying near the coast a few days back. Didn't sit right." Theodora closed her eyes. She should have seen it coming. Should have known the Venetians would sell them out the moment it suited them. The Cypriot cleared his throat. "So, where to now?" She opened her eyes and stared out at the darkening sea. There was only one place left. Constantinople. Chapter 68. The city of her birth was both familiar and alien. The skyline still dominated by Hagia Sophia, though its crosses had long since been replaced by crescents, the streets still teeming with merchants and beggars, though now the language of trade was Turkish, not Greek. Theodora moved through them like a ghost, her hood drawn low, her steps measured. She had no plan, no allies, no grand scheme for revenge. Only a name, Demetrios. Her brother had given her a list of potential allies once. Now it was time to see if any of them remembered their homeland. The first name on the smudged parchment led her to a cramped scriptorium near the old Forum of Constantine, where a hunched-over scribe copied legal documents for the Ottoman courts. He looked up when she entered, his watery eyes narrowing. Were closed. Theodora placed a coin on the desk between them. "I need information." The scribe eyed the coin but didn't touch it. "What kind?" She leaned closer. "The kind that gets men killed." The scribe's breath hitched. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he reached out and took the coin. "Come back tonight, after the call to prayer." Chapter 69. The scribe's name was Leo, and he had been a deacon in the Church of the Holy Apostles before the fall. Now he copied marriage contracts and property deeds for the Turks, his hands steady but his heart, it seemed, still Byzantine. "There are others," he whispered as they huddled in the back room of the scriptorium, the only light a single guttering candle. "Not many, but enough." Theodora listened as he listed names: a cook in the Grand Vizier's household, a guard at the Imperial Arsenal, a laundress who serviced the Janissary barracks. Small players, perhaps, but in the right positions. And Demetrios? She asked when he finished. Does he know about this? Leo's expression darkened. Yusuf, no, he's content in his role. Theodora's fingers tightened around the hilt of her dagger. What role? Leo hesitated, then sighed. He works in the Sultan's private library now. Copies maps, translates treaties. Some say Mehmed himself seeks his counsel. Theodora's stomach twisted. Her brother, advising the man who had destroyed their world. It was worse than she'd imagined. She stood abruptly. I need to see him. Leo shook his head. Impossible. The palace is too well guarded. Theodora smiled. Not for me. Chapter 70. The Topkapi Palace was a sprawling complex of courtyards and gardens, its walls patrolled by janissaries day and night. Theodora observed it for a week, noting the patterns of the guards, the comings and goings of servants, the moments when the great gates stood open for deliveries. On the 8th night, she slipped in with a group of kitchen workers, her headscarf concealing her face, her posture hunched to mimic their weary gait. The palace kitchens were a riot of heat and noise, the air thick with the scent of roasting meat and spices. Theodora kept her head down as she accepted a tray of sweets from a harried cook and fell in line with the other servers. No one questioned her, no one even looked at her twice. The Grand Vizier's quarters were on the second level, overlooking the Bosphorus. Theodora knew Demetrios wouldn't be there, not at this hour, but she needed to see the layout, to understand the rhythms of the palace. She delivered her tray to a group of officials deep in discussion, her ears straining to catch their words. The Sultan returns from Edirne tomorrow, one was saying. The celebrations will last 3 days. Another chuckled. Plenty of time for our friends to make their move. The first man hushed him with a sharp look, and Theodora had to force herself to keep moving, to not react. A plot against Mehmed. Now that was interesting. Chapter 71. The library was in a quiet wing of the palace, its doors guarded but not heavily. Theodora waited until the guards changed shifts, then slipped inside, her breath coming fast. The room was vast, its shelves lined with thousands of volumes in Arabic, Greek, Persian. At a desk near the window, a lone figure bent over a manuscript, his back to her. Theodora knew that posture, that tilt of the head. Hello, brother. Demetrios, Yusuf, startled so violently he knocked over his inkwell. Theodora. His voice was a strangled whisper. What in God's name are you doing here? She stepped closer, her gaze sweeping the room for any sign of alarm. I came to see you. Demetrios stood, his face pale. You need to leave, now. If they find you, they won't. Theodora crossed her arms. I hear you've risen in the world. The Sultan's personal translator now. His jaw tightened. It's just a job, like advising him on how to crush the last of the Byzantine resistance. Demetrios flinched. You don't understand. Then explain it to me. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, I'm trying to save what's left of our people. Theodora blinked. What? Demetrios glanced toward the door, then pulled her into a shadowed alcove. Mehmed isn't a fool. He knows rebellions simmer in the provinces. But he also knows not all Greeks are enemies. Some, like me, can be useful. He met her gaze. And useful people can ask for favors. Theodora's mind raced. What kind of favors? Churches left standing. Families spared. Books preserved. He hesitated. Information. She stared at him. All this time, she thought him a traitor. But what if he'd been playing a deeper game? The rebels in the Morea were doomed from the start, he said gently. Theodora, you have to understand, Constantinople is gone. The empire is gone. But our people, our culture, that doesn't have to die. She wanted to argue, to rage, to call him a coward. But the look in his eyes stopped her. He believed what he was saying. And worse, he might be right. Chapter 72. The sound of footsteps in the corridor snapped them both to attention. Demetrios grabbed her arm. You need to go, now. Theodora hesitated. What about the plot against Mehmed? His eyes widened. How did you? Doesn't matter. Who's behind it? Demetrios shook his head. I don't know, but if you value your life, stay out of it. The footsteps grew closer. With a muttered curse, Demetrios shoved her toward a side door. Go, and don't come back. Theodora wanted to argue, but the urgency in his voice brooked no disagreement. She slipped out just as the door opened, catching a glimpse of red janissary caps before it swung shut behind her. The corridor was dim and empty, but she knew better than to linger. She retraced her steps through the palace, her mind churning. A plot against Mehmed, her brother playing both sides. And now, what? She couldn't go back to the Morea, couldn't stay in Constantinople, couldn't keep running forever. The answer, when it came, was so obvious she nearly laughed. She needed to see the Sultan for herself. Chapter 73. The celebrations for Mehmed's return were as opulent as promised, the streets lined with cheering crowds, the air thick with the scent of rosewater and roasted meats. Theodora watched from a rooftop near the processional route, her hood pulled low, her dagger strapped to her thigh. Below, the Sultan's retinue passed in a glittering wave, janissaries in their tall hats, viziers in silken robes, and finally Mehmed himself, resplendent on a white stallion, his face unreadable beneath the shadow of his turban. Theodora studied him, this man who had destroyed her world, who now ruled an empire greater than Rome's. He looked younger than she'd expected, his beard barely touched with grey, his eyes sharp and calculating. Not a monster, then. Just a man. A dangerous one. As the procession rounded the corner, a movement caught her eye, a flicker of steel from a nearby balcony. Theodora's breath caught. The assassins were here, and they were about to change history. Chapter 74. Theodora moved without thinking, her body acting before her mind could catch up. She leapt from the rooftop to the balcony below, landing just as the would-be assassin drew his bow. He turned at the sound, his eyes widening in surprise, and then pain as Theodora's dagger found his throat. The shot went wild, the arrow embedding itself in a wooden beam as the man crumpled. Shouts erupted from the street below. Theodora didn't wait to see if there were others. She vaulted over the balcony railing and dropped into an alley, her heart pounding. What had she just done? She'd saved the man who'd destroyed her world. Why? The answer came as she slipped through the back streets, the sounds of pursuit fading behind her. Mehmed alive meant stability, Mehmed dead meant chaos, and chaos got people like her brother killed. She wasn't ready to forgive the Sultan, but she wasn't ready to watch the world burn either. Chapter 75. The safe house was empty when Theodora returned, the scribe Leo nowhere to be found. She didn't wait to see if he'd been arrested or fled. She gathered her few belongings and left, melting into the city's underbelly. The next few days were a blur of hiding and watching, listening for news of the failed assassination, of the Sultan's wrath, of the purge that would surely follow. But to her surprise, the city remained calm. No mass arrests, no bodies on the walls. Just a quiet tightening of security, a few officials replaced. It wasn't until a week later that the message came. A scrap of parchment slipped under the door of her latest bolt hole. The eagle thanks you. No signature, none needed. Theodora stared at the words for a long moment, then burned them. She didn't need thanks. She didn't know what she needed anymore. Chapter 76. The knock came at midnight, soft but insistent. Theodora had her dagger drawn before the second rap, her body tense. Who's there? Open the door, little bird. The Cypriot. She lowered the blade and let him in, taking in his travel-stained clothes and weary expression. How did you find me? He shrugged. I ask questions. People answer. He tossed a heavy purse onto the table. That's for you. Theodora eyed it warily. From whom? Does it matter? He grinned. Let's just say certain parties are grateful for your intervention. She didn't touch the money. What now? The Cypriot's grin faded. Now you choose. Stay here, take your chances. Or come with me. Where? Anywhere. Everywhere. He met her gaze. The world's bigger than empires, Theodora. She thought of Demetrios, of Alexios, of all the ghosts that haunted her. Then she picked up the purse and tucked it into her belt. When do we leave? Chapter 77. The rising phoenix sailed at dawn, its patched sails catching the morning wind as Constantinople's skyline faded behind them. Theodora stood at the rail, watching the city disappear, the city of her birth, her loss, her tangled loyalties. The Cypriot joined her, handing her a cup of something strong. Regrets. She took a sip, the liquor burning its way down her throat. Too many to count. He chuckled. That's life. The horizon stretched before them, endless and open. Theodora didn't know what lay ahead, new wars, new loves, new betrayals. But for the first time in years, she felt something like peace. The past was dead, the future was unwritten, and she, Theodora of Constantinople, sister of a traitor, daughter of a dead empire, savior of a sultan, was finally free. Chapter 78. The sea was calm the night the Cypriot died. They'd been sailing the Aegean for months, trading where they could, smuggling where they must, staying one step ahead of the law and the waves. The attack came without warning, a pirate galley emerging from the twilight, its decks swarming with cutthroats. The Cypriot took a crossbow bolt to the chest defending the ship, his laughter turning to a wet cough as he slumped against the mast. Theodora fought like a demon, her dagger finding throats and eyes and soft places, but it wasn't enough. The phoenix burned as she dragged the Cypriot into the longboat, his blood slick on her hands. Should have stayed in Constantinople, he gasped as she rowed for a nearby island, his one eye fixed on the flames. Theodora didn't answer. There was nothing to say. He died as the first light touched the waves, his hand in hers, his last breath a whisper of a joke she didn't quite catch. She buried him on the island beneath a scraggly olive tree, the only marker a jagged piece of ship's plank driven into the earth. The rising phoenix was gone. The Cypriot was gone, and Theodora was alone again. Chapter 79. The island was small and mostly uninhabited. A few fishermen's huts, a makeshift shrine to St. Nicholas, a handful of goats grazing the rocky hillsides. Theodora stayed long enough to heal from her wounds, then bartered her way onto a fishing boat heading north. She had no destination in mind, no plan beyond survival. The coins from Mehmed's purse bought her passage to Thessalonica, then overland to the Danube, where the remnants of Byzantium's diaspora eked out a living under Ottoman rule. In a dusty border town, she heard rumors of a mercenary company hiring, men and women both, no questions asked. The captain was a grizzled Serb with a nose like a broken knuckle and a laugh like grinding stones. He took one look at Theodora's hands, the calluses, the scars, the way they never strayed far from her dagger, and nodded. "You'll do." She didn't ask who they'd be fighting for. It didn't matter. War was war. Payment was payment. And oblivion, when it came, would be a mercy. Chapter 80. Complete version. The years blurred together after that, campaigns in the Carpathians, skirmishes along the Dalmatian coast, winters spent huddled in drafty barracks or the beds of temporary lovers. Theodora fought well, killed without remorse, drank to forget. Her name became whispered among mercenary bands, the Greek woman with the dead eyes and the live blade, but she no longer cared for reputation. War was a wheel, and she was just another body caught in its grinding spokes. One frozen morning in the winter of 1475, she woke in a ditch outside Belgrade, her armor crusted with blood that wasn't hers, her head pounding from cheap Moldovan wine. The Serb captain was shouting orders, his breath steaming in the air. "Up, you dogs. The Turks are pushing north." Theodora spat into the snow and rolled to her feet. Another battle, another meaningless slaughter. But then the captain grabbed her arm, his voice dropping. "Not you. Got something else for you." He jerked his chin toward a cloaked figure waiting by the tree line. "Man's paying silver for a guide who knows the Pontic coast." Theodora squinted. The stranger stood unnaturally still, his face hidden, his gloved hands folded over the pommel of a sword too fine for a common sellsword. Something prickled at the back of her neck. "Who is he?" The captain shrugged. Says he's Genoese, but he speaks Greek like a scholar and watches the roads like an Ottoman spy. He pressed a coin into her palm, Venetian ducat, not the usual copper. Take him where he wants to go, then disappear. Theodora clenched the coin. She should refuse, but the stranger's presence hummed with purpose, and purpose was a rare thing in this endless war. She strode toward him, her dagger loose in its sheath. You're looking for a guide. The man lifted his head. The hood shadowed his face, but his voice sent a shock through her, cultured, quiet, and horribly familiar. Theodora. Her breath stopped. She knew that voice, knew it from another life, before the fall, before the blood. Demetrios. Her brother stepped into the light. Chapter 81. The mercenary company dissolved in the spring of 1476, its ranks thinned by battle, desertion, and the pox that swept through their winter camp. Theodora stood over the shallow grave of the Serb captain, dead from fever, not steel, and weighed her options. She could join another company, drift south to the Italian states where condottieri still hired swords, or vanish into the anonymity of some backwater village. None of the choices appealed to her. The war had hollowed her out, leaving only a shell of the girl who had once dreamed of revenge. She was turning away from the gravesite when a hand caught her arm. One of the surviving mercenaries, a lanky Hungarian with a scar across his lip, nodded toward the road. You hear about the trouble in Wallachia? Theodora shook him off. What trouble? The Hungarian grinned. Some mad voivode named Dracula is giving the Turks hell. They say he impales prisoners by the thousands. Theodora's fingers twitched toward her dagger. A man who fought the Ottomans so viciously was worth meeting. Where? Chapter 82. The road to Targovista was lined with corpses. Theodora counted 50 before she stopped, their rotting flesh black with crows, their skeletal hands reaching for a sky they would never see again. The stories hadn't lied. Voivode Dracula was a butcher. But as she approached the capital, the truth became clearer. These weren't random victims. They wore Ottoman uniforms. The guards at the gate eyed her with suspicion but let her pass when she showed them her mercenary tattoos, the mark of a sellsword who had fought Turks before. The city stank of smoke and fear, its people scurrying like rats before a storm. Theodora found the voivode in the central square, overseeing the punishment of a group of boyars accused of treason. He was taller than she'd expected, his face gaunt, his eyes burning with a fervor that bordered on madness. When he noticed her watching, he crooked a finger. You, come here. Chapter 83. Dracula's breath reeked of wine and raw meat as he leaned close, his gaze raking over Theodora like a blade testing for weakness. You're no Wallachian. She didn't flinch. No, a mercenary, then. His lip curled. I have no use for sellswords. Loyalty is bought with blood, not coin. Theodora met his stare. My blood is yours if you're truly fighting the Turks. Something flickered in Dracula's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or grudging respect. He straightened and gestured to the impaled corpses. You see what happens to those who betray me. She didn't look away. I see what happens to your enemies. A slow smile spread across the voivode's face. Good. He turned to his guards. Give her a horse and a spear. We ride at dawn. Chapter 84. The campaign that followed was a nightmare of fire and blood. Dracula's forces struck fast and vanished into the Carpathian forests, leaving behind only death and terror. Theodora fought at his side, her dagger finding Ottoman throats as his men torched villages and poisoned wells. It was brutal, it was effective, and it sickened her. One night, after a particularly vicious raid, she confronted him. You're no better than them. Dracula didn't look up from sharpening his sword. The Turks understand only strength. This isn't strength, Theodora snapped. This is madness. The voivode's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with bruising force. You dare? She twisted free and stepped back, her dagger drawn. I've killed for you. I'll keep killing Turks until the day I die. But this, she gestured to the smoldering village behind them. This makes you a monster. For a moment, she thought he might strike her down. Then, to her surprise, Dracula laughed. We are all monsters here, girl. The only question is, whose monster will you be? Chapter 85. Theodora left Wallachia in the dead of night, stealing a horse and riding south until the stench of burning flesh faded from her clothes. Dracula's war wasn't hers. Not like this. She crossed the Danube into Ottoman territory, her mind adrift. Where now? Back to Constantinople, to Demetrios, if he still lived. Or further, to the lands she'd only heard of in tavern tales, Venice, Rome, beyond. The decision was made for her when a patrol of Sipahis caught her near Nicopolis. She killed two before they overwhelmed her, the curved blades at her throat as they dragged her before their commander. The man was young for his rank, his beard barely grown, his armor polished to a mirror shine. He studied her with detached curiosity. A woman. Interesting. Theodora spat blood at his feet. Kill me and be done with it. The Ottoman smiled. Oh number. The Sultan pays well for rebels. Especially pretty ones. Chapter 86. The chains chafed Theodora's wrists as the slave caravan wound its way toward Edirne. She'd been stripped of her weapons, her boots, even the ragged mercenary tattoos burned from her skin with lye. The other prisoners were a mix of Wallachian rebels and captured mercenaries, their spirits broken by the march. Theodora kept her head down and her eyes open, watching for any chance to escape. It came on the third night, when a summer storm rolled in, the rain coming down in sheets. The guards huddled under makeshift shelters, their attention lax. Theodora worked her shackles loose with a scrap of metal she'd palmed during the day's march, then slit the throat of the nearest sentry with his own dagger. The chaos that followed was brief and brutal. By the time the alarm was raised, she was already gone, vanishing into the storm like a ghost. Chapter 87. The farmhouse was abandoned, its roof half collapsed, its fields overgrown. Theodora sheltered there for 3 days, nursing her wounds and planning her next move. She couldn't keep running forever. Sooner or later, the past would catch up to her. On the fourth morning, she woke to the sound of hoofbeats. Theodora reached for a weapon she no longer had as the door creaked open. The man who stepped inside was older, his hair streaked with gray, his face lined with years and worry. But she would have known those eyes anywhere. Demetrios, her brother, alive. He took a hesitant step forward. I've been looking for you. Chapter 88. Theodora didn't move. How did you find me? Demetrios sighed and sat on a crumbling stool. The Sultan's spies are everywhere. When I heard a woman matching your description had been captured near Nicopolis. He trailed off, shaking his head. I called in favors, rode through the night. Theodora studied him. He looked tired, older than his years, but there was a steadiness to him now, a quiet strength she hadn't seen before. Why? Demetrios met her gaze. Because it's time to stop running. Both of us. He reached into his robe and pulled out a rolled parchment. Mehmed is offering amnesty to former rebels. A new start. Theodora laughed bitterly. You expect me to swear loyalty to the man who destroyed our home? I expect you to survive, Demetrios said softly. Theodora, the empire is gone. But was still here. He unrolled the parchment, revealing not an edict, but a map. There's a village near Bursa. Quiet, out of the way, no one would bother you there. She stared at the map, her throat tight. A part of her wanted to refuse, to spit in the face of this peace he offered. But another part, the part that was so very tired, whispered that maybe, just maybe, it was enough. Chapter 89. The village was smaller than Demetrios had described. A handful of houses clinging to the slopes of Mount Uludag, their terraced fields golden in the autumn light. Theodora stood at the edge of the square, her few belongings in a sack over her shoulder, and tried to imagine calling this place home. The locals eyed her with cautious curiosity, but no one questioned her. Demetrios had arranged everything: a cottage, a stipend, a new name. She was no longer Theodora of Constantinople. Now, she was simply Anna, a widow from the west. The lie sat heavy on her tongue, but she would bear it. For him, for herself. Chapter 90. Winter came early to the mountains, snow blanketing the village in silence. Theodora, Anna, spent her days mending clothes for the locals, her nights staring into the fire, trying not to remember. Demetrios visited when he could, bringing news from the wider world, Mehmed's campaigns in Italy, the growing power of the Venetian fleet, the whispers of a new threat from the east called the Safavids. Theodora listened but said little. That life was behind her now, or so she told herself. Then, one evening, as the first buds of spring appeared, a stranger rode into the village. He was tall, his face hidden beneath a traveler's hood, his horse lathered from hard riding. Theodora knew before he even spoke, knew from the way he sat the saddle, the way his hand rested near his sword. A fighter, like her. The stranger dismounted and approached her cottage. When he pushed back his hood, she saw the familiar glint of a gold-capped tooth. The Albanian. He grinned. "Miss me, little bird." Chapter 91. The Albanian hadn't come alone. Behind him, a dozen riders waited at the village edge, hard-eyed men and women with the look of veterans. Theodora crossed her arms. "You're a long way from Ragusa." The Albanian shrugged. "War makes for strange roads." He jerked his chin toward the mountains. "There's a pass north of here the Turks don't watch closely. We've been using it to move supplies. People, too." Theodora's pulse quickened. "Rebels, survivors." The Albanian's grin faded. "Theodora, we need you. The fight's not over." She turned away, staring at the cottage she'd begun to think of as home. The quiet life, the peace Demetrios had bought for her. But the past wasn't done with her yet. Perhaps it never would be. The Albanian stepped closer. "They're your people. They need someone who remembers what we were." Theodora closed her eyes. Constantinople's ghosts whispered to her, her mother's voice, her brother's laughter, the screams of the fallen. When she opened them again, her decision was made. "Give me an hour." Chapter 92. Demetrios found her packing. He stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. "You're leaving?" Theodora didn't look up. "Yes." "Why?" She paused, a spare tunic in her hands. "Because someone has to remember." Demetrios sighed and stepped inside. "I could stop you." Theodora finally met his gaze. "You could try." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the scribe and the warrior, the peacemaker and the rebel. Then Demetrios reached into his robe and pulled out a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. "Take this." Theodora unfolded the cloth to reveal a dagger, the mother-of-pearl hilted one she'd lost in Wallachia. Her throat tightened. "How?" The Albanian found me first. Demetrios managed a faint smile. "I thought you might need it." Theodora slipped the dagger into her belt, the weight familiar and comforting. "Thank you." Demetrios pulled her into a rough embrace. "Come back alive." She held on tighter than she meant to. "I'll try." Chapter 93. The pass was as treacherous as the Albanian had promised, the narrow trail slick with melting snow, the wind howling like a living thing. Theodora rode at the head of the column, her hood pulled low against the cold. Behind her, the rebels muttered among themselves, casting wary glances at the cliffs above. The Albanian fell into step beside her. "You're quiet." Theodora didn't answer. She was thinking of Demetrios, of the life she'd left behind. Wondering if she'd made the right choice. The Albanian nudged her. "Look." He pointed ahead, where the pass widened into a hidden valley. A cluster of tents and rough-built huts sprawled across the meadow, smoke curling from a dozen cookfires. People moved among them, men sharpening swords, women grinding grain, children chasing chickens. A makeshift banner fluttered in. The wind, a double-headed eagle, faded but unmistakable. Theodora's breath caught, the last remnants of Byzantium, clinging to existence in this forgotten place. The Albanian grinned. "Welcome home." Chapter 94. The rebels called themselves the Shadow Empire, a jest at first, then a badge of pride. They were a motley crew, former soldiers, escaped slaves, disgraced nobles, and everything in between. Theodora moved among them, learning the names, their stories, the grudges. Some had lost families in the fall of Constantinople. Others had been born under Ottoman rule but dreamed of something more. All of them looked to her with a hope that terrified her. The Albanian clapped her on the shoulder one evening as they surveyed the camp. "They need a leader." Theodora shook her head. "I'm not that. You're as close as they've got." He nodded toward a group training with wooden swords. "Teach them what you know. Fight with us, for them." Theodora watched the trainees, young, eager, hopelessly outmatched against the Ottoman war machine. But there was fire in their eyes. Fire she recognized. She sighed. "I'll stay, for now." Chapter 95. The seasons turned. The Shadow Empire grew. Raids on Ottoman supply lines became bolder, the rebels' ranks swelling with each freed slave, each disillusioned soldier. Theodora trained them, not just to fight, but to move unseen, to strike fast and vanish. They would never win a pitched battle, but they could be a thorn in the Sultan's side for years to come. The Albanian proved an able second, his cunning a match for her skill. Together, they built something fragile but fierce, a resistance that would outlast them both. One night, as they planned the next move, he asked the question she'd been dreading. "What's the endgame here?" Theodora stared into the fire. "Survival. That's not enough." She looked up. "Isn't it?" The Albanian held her gaze. "Not for you." Chapter 96. The answer came in the form of a messenger, a ragged boy who stumbled into camp with news from the coast. The Ottomans were massing ships, preparing to invade Rhodes, the last stronghold of the Knights Hospitaller. The boy gasped out his report between gulps of water. "They say, the Sultan himself will lead them." The camp erupted into debate. Some wanted to strike now, while the Ottomans were distracted. Others saw an opportunity to ally with the Knights. Theodora listened in silence, her mind racing. Then she stood. The chatter died. All eyes turned to her. "We do neither," she said. "We go to Constantinople." The Albanian frowned. "Why?" Theodora's smile was sharp as her dagger. "Because while the cat's away." Chapter 97. The city was both familiar and strange as Theodora slipped through its gates, her hood shadowing her face, her steps light and sure. The Sultan's absence was palpable, the streets quieter, the garrisons thinner, the air thick with tension. She moved like a ghost through the alleys of her youth, her mind fixed on one goal: the Imperial Archives. If the Shadow Empire was to survive, they needed more than raids and ambushes. They needed leverage, information, and Demetrios had shown her where to find it. The archives were guarded, but not well. Theodora waited until midnight, then scaled the outer wall, her fingers finding purchase in the ancient stones. Inside, the halls were dark and still. She moved quickly, her dagger in hand, her senses alert. The records room was exactly where Demetrios had described. Theodora lit a small lamp and began to search, her eyes scanning scroll after scroll. Tax records, garrison reports, supply lists. Then, there, a slim volume bound in red leather. The Sultan's private correspondence. She tucked it into her tunic and turned to leave, only to find a blade at her throat. Chapter 98. The guard was young, his hand shaking slightly as he pressed the knife to Theodora's skin. "Don't move." She recognized the accent, Greek. One of Demetrios's people, perhaps. Theodora slowly raised her hands. "I'm not your enemy." The guard's eyes flicked to the stolen book. "Thieves die all the same." Theodora took a calculated risk. "Do you know who I am?" The guard hesitated. "Should I?" She pulled back her hood just enough for him to see her face. "Tell Demetrios his sister sends her regards." The guard's eyes widened. He lowered the knife. "You're leaving." Theodora stepped past him. "And if you value your life, you'll forget you saw me." Chapter 99. The book burned in Theodora's pack as she rode hard for the mountains, its secrets a weight against her spine. Inside were names, dates, plans, the Sultan's entire network of spies and informants. With this, the Shadow Empire could strike at the heart of Ottoman power. Could weaken them from within. Could, perhaps, carve out a place for Byzantium's children in this new world. The Albanian met her at the rendezvous point, his grin wide. Get what you needed. Theodora patted the pack, and more. They rode together into the dawn, the future stretching before them, uncertain, dangerous, alive with possibility. Theodora of Constantinople was gone. Long live the Shadow Empress. Chapter 100. The fire crackled in the hearth of the mountain stronghold, casting flickering shadows on the faces gathered around it. Theodora stood at the head of the table, the stolen book open before her, its pages filled with the Sultan's secrets. The rebels listened intently as she laid out her plan, not for conquest, not for revenge, but for survival. A place where their people could live free, even if it was only in the shadows of the empire that had destroyed them. The Albanian raised his cup. To the Shadow Empire. The others echoed the toast, their voices rising like a promise, like a prayer. Theodora looked around at them, these broken, beautiful souls who had refused to surrender, and felt something she hadn't in years. Hope. Outside, the wind howled through the passes, carrying with it the echoes of the past and the whispers of a future yet unwritten. Theodora smiled and raised her own cup. The game wasn't over yet, and she intended to win.